Welcome. This is a place to relax and calm your mind. I share soothing bedtime stories designed to gently ease you into a peaceful sleep. Before we begin, please take a moment to tell me where you are watching from and what time you're watching this. Also, subscribe to this channel. Now ease your mind and let's begin. Take a deep breath and close your eyes. Forget about all your troubles. Tomorrow brings a new day. The Billionaire, the Widow and the Dog, a tale of love, loss, and fortune. I sit in my usual corner of the gilded vine, my whiskey glass cradled in my hand, the amber liquid reflecting the dim golden light overhead. The bar is a sanctuary for the pretentious and the desperate, and I enjoy watching both. People are fascinating in their vulnerabilities, their little tells, their unconscious performances. Some seek validation, others distraction. Some are simply here because they have nowhere else to be. Tonight my attention drifts lazily from one character to the next. A couple in their 60s, their conversation polite but distant. Married too long, I suspect, and grown tired of pretending otherwise. A man in a navy suit, his posture rigid as if keeping secrets physically stiffens the spine. A woman twirling the stem of her martini glass, her gaze searching, waiting. And then there's her. She sits at the bar, her back hunched slightly, her fingers clutched around a wine glass she has no intention of drinking. Blonde hair cascading over her shoulder, a red dress that is meant to be striking but is wrinkled at the waist, as though she's been gripping it in frustration. She's crying. Not the dramatic, attention-seeking sobs I've witnessed from others in this very establishment. No, her tears are quiet, restrained, a silent struggle, the kind people try to hide but never truly can. I shouldn't care. I don't get involved in other people's drama. But something about her, the way her shoulders shake, the way she blinks rapidly as though forcing herself to remain composed, draws me in. I down the last of my whiskey, savoring the burn, then push myself to my feet. My usual amusement in people watching falters, replaced by something more unpredictable. Curiosity. She doesn't notice as I take the seat beside her. Not at first. Her gaze is locked on the ice cubes melting in her untouched wine, her fingers tapping a thoughtless rhythm against the bar. A public breakdown in the gilded vine. Brave choice, I say, my voice low enough to avoid catching the bartender's attention. Her head jerks up, eyes blazing, red-rimmed but sharp. Excuse me? I tilt my head, studying her. Just saying, if you wanted to wallow in anonymity, there are better places than a bar where the price of a cocktail is a down payment on a car. She exhales sharply, somewhere between a scoff and a laugh. You assume I care who's watching? Everyone cares. Not me, she mutters, but the way she wipes her eyes betrays her. I lean back slightly, giving her space, but not enough to let her think I'll leave. You don't strike me as the kind of person who drowns her sorrows in overpriced wine. At least, not alone. She huffs. You don't know me. I smirk. True, but I know the type. You're not here because of heartbreak, or you'd be slurring complaints about some bastard who wronged you. You're not here for revenge, or you'd be making a show of looking fabulous instead of sitting here looking like you want to disappear. She stiffens. So what? You think you're some kind of expert on human misery? More of an observer, I admit. Misery is fascinating. Her eyes narrow. And that's why you're here? For entertainment? Not entirely. A humorless chuckle escapes her. Great. A sociopath with a whiskey. Exactly what I needed tonight. I grin at that. There's something refreshing about her bitterness. You could have just ignored me. I should have. And yet here we are. She shakes her head as if exasperated, but there's something else behind her expression. A flicker of relief, maybe, as though talking to a stranger is preferable to being left alone with her thoughts. I glance at her untouched glass. Why order wine if you weren't going to drink it? Her fingers tighten around the stem. Habit. Must be one hell of a habit. She sighs, rolling her eyes as if debating whether to answer. Then, finally, she mutters, because I could always afford to. I arch a brow. Past tense. Her lips press together, her gaze shifting to the bar as if she regrets saying anything. But I see it now, the tension in her jaw, the hesitation in her fingers. Let me guess, I say, voice quieter now. You just found out you're not as rich as you thought. Her breath catches. It's subtle, but I notice. She swallows hard. That's none of your business. I shrug. Fair enough. Silence stretches between us, filled only by the low hum of conversation around the bar. I half expect her to get up, walk away, end this strange interaction before it unfolds further. But she doesn't. Instead, she picks up her glass and downs the entire drink in one go. She slams it down, exhales, and then turns to me. Victor, right? I blink, caught off guard. How? You come here often, she says, smirking now. I've seen you, watching. I chuckle. So you do care who's watching. Only when they're interesting. And do I interest you? She leans in slightly, her gaze unreadable. I think you enjoy picking apart people's lives because yours isn't as interesting as you want it to be. I smirk, but before I can respond, her expression shifts. A sudden panic flashes in her eyes, her fingers tightening around the bar. I follow her gaze instinctively. A man has just entered the bar, his presence commanding, his expression hard. He scans the room, searching. She stiffens. Eleanor, I murmur, the name falling easily from my lips, though she never told me. Her voice is barely above a whisper. I need to go. Before I can react, she's already pushing off the stool, disappearing into the crowd. The man's gaze sweeps dangerously close to where I sit. And then, just like that, she's gone. I swirl the last of my whiskey in my glass, watching the way the liquid clings to the edges, wondering what exactly Eleanor is running from. Leo stood at the entrance of the nightclub, his heart pounding against his ribs like it was trying to break free. The neon lights flickered above, casting a cold glow on the bouncer's face as he crossed his arms, shaking his head. "You're not on the list," the bouncer said, his voice flat, unmoved. "Look, I just need to get inside. I need to see Eleanor." Leo tried to push forward, but the bouncer's hand shot out, gripping his shoulder with the force of a steel trap. "I don't care who you need to see. You're not coming in." Desperation clawed at Leo's throat. He didn't have time for this. Every second wasted here was a second closer to losing Charlie. "My dog," he blurted. He needs surgery. I don't have the money. I need Eleanor's help." The bouncer didn't even blink. To him, Leo was just another broke guy trying to talk his way into a place he didn't belong. And maybe he was. But this wasn't about him. He clenched his fists, swallowing down the humiliation rising in his chest. "Please," his voice cracked. "She'll want to see me. Just tell her I'm here." The bouncer looked him over, probably sizing up his worn-out jacket, his scuffed boots, the desperation in his eyes. He gave Leo nothing but a disinterested glance before turning back to the line. Leo felt the weight of the city pressing in on him. The laughter and music from inside taunted him, a cruel reminder that the people beyond that door didn't share his reality. His reality was cold, lonely, and crushing under the weight of debt and worry. Then, just as he was about to resign himself to another failed attempt, movement beyond the velvet rope caught his eye. Eleanor. For a second his breath stalled in his chest. She was standing at the bar, her silhouette sharp under the flashing lights, her golden hair cascading over one shoulder. It had been months since he last saw her, and yet she was just as radiant, just as untouchable. And then, as if feeling his gaze, she turned. Their eyes met. Recognition flared in her expression, followed by something he couldn't quite place. Shock? Confusion? A flicker of something softer? But before he could decipher it, another figure stepped beside her. Victor. His smirk cut through the dim lighting, his posture relaxed as he leaned in to say something to her. And then, with slow, deliberate amusement, he turned to look at Leo. Damn it. Leo knew that look. It was the look of a man who saw an opportunity to play. Eleanor was already moving, her hand gripping the edge of the bar like she needed something solid to hold on to. But Victor, he was enjoying this. He leaned down to murmur something to her, and she flinched before turning away from him and striding toward the entrance. Leo exhaled sharply as she stepped outside, her heels clicking against the pavement. The bouncer moved to stop her, but she brushed past him, her eyes locking onto Leo. Leo? Her voice was breathless, edged with something raw. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Victor appeared behind her, hands in his pockets, his smirk widening. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look who's come crawling back." Leo clenched his jaw. He didn't have time for Victor's games. Eleanor reached for him, her fingers just brushing his sleeve. "What's going on?" He swallowed hard. "Charlie, he's sick. I need help." For a moment her face softened, but then, behind her, Victor chuckled. "Oh, this is rich." He stepped forward, his voice a silk-covered blade. "You need money, Leo, and what do you plan to do for it? Beg?" Leo stiffened, fists curling at his sides. "I don't need to beg." "No?" Victor tilted his head, his smirk never faltering. "Then why are you here?" Eleanor shot him a glare. "Victor, don't." But he ignored her. His amusement had turned into something else, something colder, sharper. "I might have a proposition for you, Leo," he said, his voice dropping just enough to make Leo's stomach twist. He had the sinking feeling that whatever Victor was about to offer would come at a price he wasn't sure he could afford. And yet, with Charlie's life on the line, he wasn't sure he had a choice. Victor leaned in, his smirk widening. "How badly do you want that money?" Leo stood there, eyes dark with desperation, his shoulders hunched under the weight of whatever mess he had gotten himself into. I could see it all over him. Failure, need, and just enough foolish pride to think begging Eleanor would work. I almost pitied him. Almost. Eleanor, on the other hand, kept her expression unreadable, lips pressed into a thin line. At first, she didn't say anything, didn't move, just looked at him like he was something distant, something from a life she had left behind. I leaned back against the polished bar, swirling the whiskey in my glass, savoring the rich scent. This was better than entertainment. It was a study in power. "Eleanor, please." Leo tried again, his voice lower now. "Charlie doesn't have much time." A flicker. Just a flicker. But I saw it in Eleanor's eyes. Hesitation, guilt. She was a sentimental fool at heart, and Leo knew it. He was playing the one card he had left, and damn it all, it was working. I sighed dramatically, setting my drink down with an audible clink. "A dog, Leo? Really? That's what brings you crawling back?" Leo's eyes darted to me, but he didn't take the bait. Smart. He knew I wasn't going to make this easy. Eleanor exhaled sharply, looking away as if trying to convince herself not to care. But it was too late. I could practically see her resolve cracking. "How much is the surgery?" she asked finally, arms crossed over her chest. Leo hesitated, but when he answered, his voice was steady. 3,000. I laughed, actually laughed. "You're asking her to throw 3 grand at a mutt?" I shook my head. "That's rich." Eleanor shot me a look, the kind that usually preceded some biting remark. but this time she kept her focus on Leo. She reached into her purse, already pulling out her phone. "I'll cover it," she said. Oh, how predictable. And just like that, she was letting him win. I smirked because that was the thing about Eleanor. She hated being heartless. But me? I reveled in it. "Well," I mused, stretching my arms, "that's sweet of you. Generous, even." Then, with a slow grin, I added, "I'll double it." Leo stiffened, his fists clenching at his sides. He didn't want my money, but that wasn't the point. The point was watching him squirm. Eleanor turned to me, eyes narrowing. "You're just trying to make a spectacle of this." "Of course," I admitted freely. "It's fun." She huffed out a breath, irritated. "Fine, then triple it." Ah, now that I didn't expect. My smirk faltered for half a second, just long enough for her to notice, and I knew it. Damn it. I could back out, call her bluff, let her win this one. But that would be too easy, wouldn't it? And if there was one thing I despised, it was losing. "Done," I said, my voice smooth despite the irritation curling in my chest. 9,000. Eleanor's lips twitched, the ghost of a smirk playing at their edges. She had gotten to me, and she knew it. Leo just stared, torn between relief and confusion. But I wasn't looking at him anymore, because this game had just gotten interesting, and I never played to lose. I leaned back in my chair, fingers still curled around my phone as Eleanor's voice faded into silence. She had hesitated before agreeing, just long enough for me to know she was considering my offer seriously. That was all I needed. A crack in the wall, a small opening where I could slip through. Eleanor was proud, always had been. The idea of accepting help, especially from me, would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, were they? I pushed myself up from the desk and strode toward the window. The city stretched out beneath me, glittering under the rain-streaked sky. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of my lips. She'd show up tomorrow, guarded and poised, ready to turn my offer into some kind of battlefield where she could prove she didn't need saving. That was fine. I wasn't offering to save her. I was offering her control. Control over her failing finances. Control over a situation that had clearly spiraled out of her grasp. And if she was smart, if she was still the Eleanor I knew, she'd see that working with me wasn't a weakness. It was leverage. Of course, there was also the matter of unfinished business between us, the kind neither of us had dared to acknowledge for years. That, I suspected, would be a much trickier negotiation. My phone buzzed again, snapping me out of my thoughts. I glanced down at the screen, expecting a follow-up message from Eleanor. "Unknown number, don't meet with her." A cold prickle ran down my spine. I frowned, tilting my head slightly, debating whether this was some kind of prank, a scam, a wrong number. But as I was about to lock my phone, another message came through. "Unknown number. She's not who you think she is." I sat back down, my grip tightening around the device. My mind immediately began dissecting possibilities. Was this a warning? A threat? Some jealous ex-business partner of hers trying to scare me off? Or worse, was this someone who knew something I didn't? I exhaled through my nose, slow and steady, forcing myself to remain calm. This wasn't the first time I'd received an anonymous message. It wouldn't be the last. People in my line of work always attracted ghosts, whispers, those who thought they could manipulate from the shadows, but that wasn't how I operated. I fired back a response. Me. Who is this? No answer. I waited a full minute, then two. Nothing. A quiet tension settled over the room. For the first time since I'd made that call to Eleanor, a nagging question pulled at the back of my mind. What if I didn't know everything about her situation? What if there was something bigger that she hadn't told me? I ran a hand down my face, exhaling. It didn't matter. I was meeting her tomorrow, with or without anonymous warnings. And if there was something she wasn't telling me, I would find out, one way or another. As Eleanor sipped her wine, her eyes darted to me over the rim of her glass, calculating, cautious. The deal was laid out between us as plainly as the meal we had just consumed. A feast of indulgence fitting for the gravity of our arrangement. My terms had been clear. Financial guidance for her, influence for me. There was nothing inherently dishonorable in it, but Eleanor was the type who did not agree to anything lightly. She let the silence stretch between us, a deliberate move on her part, no doubt. If she hoped to rattle me, she would be disappointed. I thrived in these spaces, in the push and pull of negotiation, in the art of knowing exactly how much to give and how much to take. "You want access to my social circles," she said finally, placing her glass down with a deliberate grace. "What exactly do you intend to do with it?" I smiled, letting just enough amusement slip into my expression to remind her that I was not so easily disarmed. "That depends entirely on what opportunities present themselves, my dear Eleanor. Influence is a currency more valuable than gold, and you have more of it than you know. A simple introduction to the right people, a whispered word in the right ears, that's all I require." She tapped her fingers against the table, considering. "And in return, you'll help me navigate my financial affairs?" I inclined my head. "More than that, I'll ensure you come out ahead." Her lips pressed together, skepticism warring with her need. She was wealthy, yes, but wealth alone meant little in a world where power shifted on the whims of those who truly understood the game. Eleanor had money, but she lacked the acumen to wield it as a weapon. She took a measured breath. "Very well. We have an agreement." A slow smile spread across my lips. "I knew you'd see reason." The waiter appeared to clear our table, oblivious to the weight of the pact that had just been formed. Eleanor and I sat back, both aware that this was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, I made good on my promise. Eleanor, to her credit, did not merely stand back and let me work. She watched, she questioned, and in some cases, she even challenged me. I found her resistance refreshing. It was no fun playing a game if the opponent simply conceded. She introduced me to the right people, as promised, though always with an air of subtle defiance. It was clear she did not like owing me anything, but business was business. At first, the introductions were minor, socialites, lesser-known financiers, but soon the doors began to open wider. I had my sights set on bigger targets, men and women who controlled industries with a mere flick of their wrist. Eleanor's influence gave me an entry point, but it was my own skill that allowed me to weave myself into their trust. One evening, at a gala held in one of the grandest estates in the city, I found myself conversing with Charles Whitmore, a man whose name carried weight in both business and politics. Eleanor had made the introduction with an elegant smile, though I could sense her unease. She still did not trust me, not entirely. Whitmore, however, took to me instantly. "Victor, is it? Eleanor speaks highly of you. That alone is enough to pique my interest." I laughed lightly. I hope to live up to the reputation she's bestowed upon me. We spoke at length, discussing investments, shifting economies, the delicate balance of risk and reward. By the end of the evening, Whitmore had agreed to a meeting, an opportunity I would not waste. Eleanor found me after, swirling a glass of champagne in one hand. "You work fast." "Efficiency is a virtue," I replied smoothly. She arched a brow. "Just remember, Victor, you may be good at what you do, but in my world, trust is a delicate thing. Play your cards too aggressively, and you may find doors shutting just as quickly as they opened." I held her gaze, letting the unspoken challenge settle between us. "Duly noted." She turned to leave, but not before offering a parting remark. "Just don't forget, you and I are not friends. This is business." Her words should have meant little, but for the first time, I wondered if she was warning me or herself. I adjusted the cufflinks on my tailored suit, watching Eleanor through the car's reflection as she stepped out onto the grand entrance of the gala. The crimson dress clung to her like a secret whispered in a crowded room, designed to catch wandering eyes but never invite them close. Eleanor knew exactly how to command attention, and tonight I needed that skill more than ever. The Seattle elite had gathered in full force: investors, socialites, opportunists dressed in silk and ambition. The charity gala was a battlefield disguised as an evening of generosity. Connections were the real currency here, and I intended to leave significantly richer. Eleanor slid her hand into the crook of my arm. "Try to keep up, Victor." I smirked. "You mean while you parade me around like a trophy?" She tilted her head, her golden earrings catching the light. "You're using me, I'm using you. It's a lovely little dance." I led her through the entrance, past the valet, the security, and into the lion's den. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, their reflections bouncing off gold-trimmed mirrors. Laughter and the clink of champagne glasses filled the air, punctuated by the occasional murmur of lucrative business deals. Eleanor wasted no time. She swept me toward a cluster of men near the bar. Old money, the kind that built cities and crushed competitors with the same ease. She greeted them with air kisses and whispered pleasantries, making it clear that she belonged. She knew their wives, their scandals, their hidden vices, and in introducing me, she ensured I was part of their circle, even if just for the evening. "Victor, darling, have you met Charles Belmont?" she said, placing her hand delicately on my arm as she directed my gaze to a silver-haired man with sharp blue eyes. I extended my hand. "A pleasure, Mr. Belmont." He gave me a calculating look before shaking my hand. "Eleanor speaks highly of you." "Then I hope I live up to the hype." Belmont chuckled, but there was a challenge in his eyes. The night was far from over, and I needed to prove I wasn't just Eleanor's latest accessory. Meanwhile, across the room, a stark contrast to the polished crowd emerged. Scruffy. He wasn't meant to be here, but Eleanor had insisted. She claimed every event needed an element of unpredictability, and Scruffy, in his ill-fitting tuxedo and endearing cluelessness, was exactly that. Scruffy, real name unknown, had a way of charming people against their better judgment. He was like an errant gust of wind in a room full of carefully composed symphonies. While I played the game with precision, Scruffy stumbled through it and somehow won anyway. I spotted him near the hors d'oeuvres, engaging a group of women twice his age in animated conversation. They laughed, leaning in as if he were spinning the most tantalizing of tales. Eleanor followed my gaze and smirked. "You underestimate him," she said. "Scruffy has a gift." I scoffed. "He has no strategy." "Exactly. And that's why it works." I returned my attention to Belmont, shifting the conversation toward investments, innovation, anything that would cement my presence beyond Eleanor's introduction. But the moment Scruffy drifted near, the entire dynamic shifted. Belmont, guarded and shrewd, softened in Scruffy's presence. The man who would normally interrogate potential business partners with unrelenting scrutiny suddenly found himself chuckling at Scruffy's effortless charm. "You know," Belmont mused, swirling his whiskey, "sometimes the best opportunities come from the most unexpected places." I caught Eleanor's knowing glance. She loved this. Watching the pieces fall into place. She thrived on orchestrating these moments, on reminding people she was still relevant, still powerful. "You could learn from him," she whispered. I arched a brow. "What, trip over my own feet and hope for the best?" She leaned in, her breath warm against my ear. "Loosen your grip on the game, Victor. Sometimes the best moves are the ones you don't plan." The night unraveled in layers. Eleanor and I maneuvered through the crowd, securing handshakes and whispered promises of future meetings. Scruffy, in his own chaotic way, strengthened our position by charming the uncharmable. By the time the gala reached its peak, speeches, silent auctions, the inevitable reveal of some philanthropic endeavor that would double as a tax write-off, I realized Eleanor and I had done more than just survive the night. We had won. As we stepped out onto the balcony, away from the murmuring masses, Eleanor let out a satisfied sigh. I'd say this was a successful evening. I nodded, watching the city lights shimmer beyond the terrace. You're dangerous when you're in your element. She laughed, soft but sharp. And you? You're learning. I turned to face her, my hand brushing against hers. Maybe we make a good team. She considered that for a moment before smirking. A strategic partnership, then? I held her gaze. Something like that. And just like that, our game evolved. What had started as a test became an unspoken agreement, a dangerous, exhilarating balance of power and ambition. Scruffy, somewhere in the crowd, was likely securing himself another invitation to a world he didn't belong to. Eleanor and I, however, had no intention of leaving. We were here to stay. I never expected to enjoy Charlie's company. When I first found him, a ragged, mud-caked mutt abandoned outside my apartment building, I convinced myself I was doing a good deed. Nothing more. But now, a few weeks in, something had changed. He wasn't just a stray I'd taken in. He was mine. Tonight I sat cross-legged on my worn-out couch, brushing Charlie's tangled fur while he sprawled across my lap, his head resting on my knee. His tail thumped against the cushions lazily, his contentment clear. The warm glow of my floor lamp bathed the apartment in a soft golden hue, and for the first time in a long time, the space felt lived in, not just a place I slept between shifts, but a home. You know, you're really growing on me, I murmured, rubbing behind his ears. He huffed out a pleased sigh, his body going boneless against me. The moment of peace was abruptly shattered by a knock on the door, sharp, impatient. Charlie shot up, barking twice before settling into a low growl. "Easy, boy." I stood, peeling him off me before padding to the door. Peeking through the peephole, I groaned. Victor. Yanking the door open, I leaned against the frame and crossed my arms. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? He arched a brow, clearly unimpressed by my sarcasm. You weren't answering your phone. That's usually a sign that I don't want to talk. Victor sighed, running a hand through his neatly styled dark hair. Can I come in? I hesitated. Victor wasn't the drop by unannounced type. He was the arrange things a week in advance and still cancel at the last minute type. And he had certainly never stepped foot in my apartment before. Charlie took that moment to push his way forward, squeezing past my legs to stand between me and Victor, his tail raised in cautious curiosity. Victor took a full step back. You got a dog, he stated, as if he needed confirmation for what was clearly happening right in front of him. No, Victor, I've been hallucinating this entire time. I motioned for him to come in, then shut the door behind him as he cautiously made his way inside. Relax, he doesn't bite. Victor looked down at Charlie like the dog had personally offended him. He looks unkempt. Well, he was abandoned and living on the street, so forgive him for not fitting your aesthetic. I rolled my eyes and moved past him, plopping back down onto the couch. Charlie trotted back over, hopping up beside me and resting his chin on my thigh. Victor eyed the dog, then slowly, as if against his will, sat in the chair across from us. So, why haven't you answered your phone? I've been busy. With him? He nodded toward Charlie, still looking skeptical. Partly. I scratched behind Charlie's ear, and his eyes fluttered shut in bliss. I've also been working and enjoying my silence. Victor exhaled, but didn't argue. That alone was interesting. Normally he would have pressed me until I caved and explained myself. Instead, he just sat there staring at Charlie. The dog stared back. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Victor extended a hand. Charlie sniffed it, then, much to my delight, gave Victor's fingers a slow, deliberate lick. I barely stifled my laugh as Victor's mouth pressed into a tight line. He looked at his hand like it had been personally betrayed. I smirked. Well, well, well. Victor shot me a glare. Don't. Oh, I have to. I leaned forward, grinning. Victor, are you bonding? He scoffed. Hardly. But he didn't pull his hand away. Charlie, sensing an opportunity, nosed at his palm before nudging his knee, demanding further attention. And then it happened. Victor, stoic, logical, completely unwilling to engage in anything remotely sentimental, hesitantly, almost reluctantly, petted Charlie's head. I gasped theatrically. You like him. I don't. You do. I don't. Charlie wagged his tail, pressing further into Victor's touch. I grinned. You totally do. Victor sighed, finally withdrawing his hand and shaking his head as if trying to rid himself of whatever spell Charlie had cast over him. He's tolerable. Sure. I leaned back, crossing my arms. You know what this means, don't you? Victor arched a brow. What? I smirked. You're losing your edge. He scoffed, but didn't deny it. Instead, he studied Charlie for another long moment before muttering, Don't expect me to start volunteering at shelters or anything. I laughed. I wouldn't dream of it. But as I watched him steal another glance at Charlie, something softened in his expression. And for the first time, I had the distinct feeling that Victor, despite all his careful emotional detachment, might not be as unreachable as he liked to pretend. Charlie, ever perceptive, let out a huff of approval before curling up beside me once more, completely at ease. And just like that, Victor's fate was sealed. Not that he'd admit it. Not yet, anyway. I sat on the edge of my sleek, minimalistic couch, elbows resting on my knees, fingers pressed against my temples. The city lights sprawled beneath my penthouse, twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but they did little to brighten the storm cloud hanging over me. The sound of heels clicking against the polished marble floors drew my attention. I looked up, and there she was, Eleanor, as composed as ever, eyes filled with something dangerously close to satisfaction. She let out a slow breath. Never thought I'd see the day. I met her gaze, but the usual fire wasn't there. I was too drained for it. If you're here to gloat, don't bother. She strolled further inside, taking in the room as if it were hers. Oh, but I should. You certainly never held back when the roles were reversed. My lips pressed into a thin line. Eleanor took a seat across from me, crossing one leg over the other, hands resting gracefully on her knee. All right, let's hear it. I exhaled, rubbing my face before leaning back. Tension coiled in every part of me. The acquisition didn't go as planned. There were complications. She arched a brow. Complications? I ground my jaw. Legal setbacks, investor hesitation, and someone... I leveled a look at her. Got to the board before I did. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. Imagine that. A muscle in my jaw ticked. Eleanor, I'm just saying, Victor. For a man who prides himself on always being 5 steps ahead, you seem surprisingly caught off guard. I exhaled sharply, looking away. I hated this. Hated being in a position of weakness. But here I was, sitting across from her, having no choice but to acknowledge it. She stood, smoothing down her blouse. I can help you. My gaze snapped back to her, wary. And what would that cost me? She smirked. Not money. You have plenty of that. She stepped closer, watching me carefully. I want something more valuable. I leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite myself. And that is? Admit it. My brows furrowed. Admit what? That you're not always in control. Silence stretched between us. My fingers curled slightly against my knees. Admitting such a thing was akin to stripping off my armor. I wasn't sure I could do it. Eleanor waited. Finally, my shoulders tensed and then slumped just barely. I exhaled slowly, my gaze steady but different, softer. I'm not always in control. She smiled, not smugly, not cruelly, just knowingly. See? That wasn't so hard. I rolled my eyes, but didn't pull away when she rested a hand lightly on my shoulder. There was something new between us now, something unspoken but real. The shift had begun, and neither of us could ignore it. The cold drizzle of a typical Seattle afternoon draped itself over the park, filtering through the skeletal branches of winter-stripped trees. I hated it already. A casual walk, of all things. The very concept felt so pedestrian, so unremarkable. And yet here I was, trailing behind Eleanor and her absurdly joyous golden retriever, Charlie. I checked my watch. I never checked my watch. That was for men with schedules dictated by others. I set the time. I made the calls. Yet here I was, a man of power, reduced to following a woman and her dog through damp gravel paths, the rhythmic squelch of my expensive Italian loafers pounding out the tempo of my defeat. Eleanor didn't care. She never did. That's what made her dangerous. Her soft laughter mingled with the wind as she tossed a treat to Charlie, who caught it midair and wagged his tail furiously, reveling in the simple joy of his victory. I felt a pang of irritation. Was I jealous of a dog? "I can hear you scowling," she said, glancing at me over her shoulder. Her dark green coat swayed as she walked, the collar turned up against the chill. "Lighten up, Victor." "I don't scowl." "You do, almost professionally." I exhaled, irritated that she could read me so well. Eleanor had always been good at that, at slipping past defenses and making herself comfortable in places she had no right being. Like now, here, in my time, in my carefully controlled world, where I was no longer the one in command. The deal had been simple. A wager, one she had no right to win. But Eleanor, with her infuriating knack for dismantling power structures, had bested me. One game of chess, a bet sealed with a smirk and a tilt of her head. And now I was here, repaying my debt by indulging in this utterly mundane ritual of a walk in the park. And yet she looked so at ease, as if she belonged in this world of damp earth and casual laughter, where power wasn't measured in acquisitions and wealth, but in the simple act of choosing where to place her next step. She was dangerous because she didn't want the things I did, and that made her impossible to control. "You could at least pretend to enjoy yourself," she teased, reaching down to ruffle Charlie's ears. "Even he's having fun." "He's a dog." "And you're a man who lost a bet," she said with a wicked grin. "So, technically, Charlie and I are the winners here." I gritted my teeth, but there was no malice in her words, just amusement. That somehow made it worse. I preferred enemies I could fight, ones who wanted something tangible from me so I could negotiate, manipulate, maneuver. Eleanor was different. She didn't want money or power. She didn't even want to humiliate me, which was, frankly, infuriating. She simply existed in a world I didn't understand, and worse, she was inviting me into it. We walked in silence for a while, the damp air thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. The sound of the city hummed in the distance, a constant reminder of where I belonged, where I thrived. And yet, there was something oddly grounding about the steady rhythm of Eleanor's steps beside me, the carefree bounce of Charlie ahead, completely oblivious to the intricate games of power and control that defined my world. "How do you do it?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. "Do what?" "Exist like this." I gestured vaguely at the park, the damp pathways, the absurd casualness of it all. "Without Needing to win. She tilted her head, considering. Who says I'm not winning? That stopped me. I frowned, searching for the trap, the angle, the leverage, but she simply smiled, as if the answer was obvious. This is winning, Victor, she said, stretching her arms out to encompass the quiet park, the breath of fresh air, the simplicity of just being here. Not everything has to be a fight. I didn't respond, mostly because I didn't have an answer. Winning was everything. It was the reason I woke up, the reason I built empires, the reason I played the game. But Eleanor was playing something different altogether, something I couldn't quite grasp. Charlie barked suddenly, chasing a squirrel that darted up a tree, his tail wagging in pure, unrestrained joy. Eleanor laughed, and for a moment something shifted. Maybe it was the crisp air, or the way the city seemed to fade into the background. Or maybe it was simply the fact that for once I wasn't the one calling the shots. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't mind losing. Eleanor laughed. I scowled. The dog wagged its tail, and for once I didn't mind losing. Law and Order and Pork Chops. I leaned against the glass display case at Winston's Meats, tapping my fingers on the counter as I stared down Roy Winston. The shop smelled of fresh-cut beef and sawdust, and the buzz of the overhead lights hummed between us. Roy, in his blood-stained apron, wiped his hands on a rag, his brow lined with the kind of worry that could age a man overnight. Roy, I said, my voice steady. Integrity's a thing you don't get back once you sell it. Same as a good cut of beef. Once it's spoiled, you can't just scrape the bad off. Roy sighed and scratched his salt and pepper beard. I know, Sheriff. I know. But Big Ernie's offer. It's a lot of money. I folded my arms. And what happens to the folks here when the only butcher in town turns into some chain grocery with vacuum-sealed meat? Roy didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight, looking past me toward the front window where the sun glared against the glass. Winston's had been in his family for 3 generations. His daddy, old Will Winston, ran this place till his hands couldn't grip a cleaver anymore. Folks in town depended on him, trusted him. You got customers that walk in here every day because they know you, Roy. They trust the Winston name. I lowered my voice. Big Ernie ain't got a name. He's got a business. Roy exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. It ain't just about me, Buckner. It's the bills, the economy, all of it. I nodded slowly. I'd seen it before. Good folks worn down by life, by money troubles, by the weight of making ends meet. But selling out to Big Ernie? That wasn't the answer. Before Roy could say another word, the front door swung open, and Deputy Darla Monroe stepped inside, her boots clicking against the tiled floor. She adjusted her belt, resting a hand on her holster. Sheriff, she said, giving Roy a polite nod before turning back to me. We got a situation. I exhaled sharply. What now? Tommy Langston, she said with a shake of her head. Drunk again. Passed out by the statue in front of the courthouse. Roy let out a dry chuckle. Ain't it a little early for Tommy to be making a fool of himself? Darla rolled her eyes. You'd think, but he's out there, sprawled out like he don't got a care in the world. I pinched the bridge of my nose. All right, let's go scrape Tommy off the pavement before he gets himself arrested for the 100th time. Roy gave me a parting glance. I hear you, Sheriff. I need time to think. I nodded. That's fair. Just make sure you're thinking about the right things. And with that, I followed Darla out the door, heading toward another long day in Clearwater County. It was past midnight when I found Tommy slumped against the hitching post outside Keller's saloon, his face buried in his arms. The moonlight cut a pale line across the wooden sidewalk, glinting off the near-empty bottle rolling by his boots. On your feet, Tommy, I said, nudging him with the toe of my boot. He groaned, but didn't move. I sighed. Same old story. Grabbing him under the arms, I pulled him upright. He reeked of whiskey and bad choices, his shirt damp with spilled drink. Tommy wasn't a violent drunk, never had been, but he was a fool, and a loud one at that. He squinted at me, his bloodshot eyes trying to focus. Sheriff Buckner, he slurred. My old friend. I shook my head. Ain't your friend, Tommy. Not tonight. Dragging him down the quiet street toward my office, I ignored the few folks still awake, their candle-lit windows casting long, flickering shadows. This wasn't my first time hauling Tommy Sturgill into my office for one of our little chats. Wouldn't be my last either. When we got inside, I pushed him into the chair across from my desk. He leaned back with a groan, rubbing his temples like the weight of the world had settled on his skull. You got a real talent for making my life difficult, I said, shutting the door behind me. Tommy chuckled, low and bitter. Ain't that just the story of my life? I grabbed a tin cup from the shelf, poured some water from the pitcher, and set it in front of him. Drink. He looked at it like I'd handed him snake venom. Rather have whiskey. That's the damn problem. I leaned on the desk, arms crossed. You keep doing this, Tommy. Every week I haul you in here, and every week I try to talk some sense into you. But here we are again. He sat up, glaring at me. You ever think maybe the problem ain't me, Buck? Maybe it's this town. Maybe it's you. I exhaled through my nose, keeping my temper in check. You know, Tommy, you got folks here who still care about you. You ain't too far gone. Not yet. He scoffed. Yeah? And what do you care, Sheriff? You don't know a damn thing about what it's like to be me. I pushed off the desk and paced toward the window, watching the darkened streets. I know more than you think. No, you don't. His voice rose, frustration thick in it. You ever try living outside that rule book of yours? Ever once just do what you felt instead of what you thought was right? I turned to face him, but I didn't answer. He smirked, shaking his head. Didn't think so. I should have been angrier, should have set him straight, but his words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Tommy leaned forward, rubbing his hands together like he was warming them by a fire. You know why folks like me drink, Buck? 'Cause some of us ain't got nothing else. Some of us weren't meant to walk straight lines like you, and maybe, just maybe, we don't want to. I let out a slow breath. That what you tell yourself? That's the truth. I walked back to my desk and sat down across from him. Truth is, Tommy, you got a choice. You can keep drowning yourself in whiskey, or you can try to climb out of the hole you keep digging. Ain't nobody gonna do it for you. He looked away, jaw tightening. And if I don't want to, then one of these nights I'm gonna find you face down in the dirt, and I won't be able to pull you up. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Finally, Tommy reached for the cup of water. He took a sip, grimaced, then drank the rest. Maybe, just maybe this time he heard me. Across town, Roy Dawson sat on his porch, staring into the darkness beyond his fence. The wind stirred the dry grass, whispering through the empty fields. Inside, his wife Eliza was waiting. He could hear the faint clatter of dishes as she tidied up, hear the soft hum of a tune she always sang when she thought he wasn't listening. Roy ran a hand through his hair, sighing. His father's gun belt still hung inside the house, untouched since the day the old man passed. Some folks in town figured he'd take up the badge just like his PA did. The Dawson name had carried weight in this town for a long time. But Eliza, she wanted something different. You're not your father, she had told him more than once. You don't have to carry what he did. But what if that's exactly what he was supposed to do? What if that weight wasn't a burden, but a duty? Sheriff Buckner had offered him a deputy job last week. It had been a quiet conversation over coffee at Miss Hattie's diner. No pressure, no expectation, just an offer. But it felt like more than that. He exhaled, rubbing his face. The thing was, Roy wasn't sure who he was without his father's shadow hanging over him. The front door creaked open and Eliza stepped onto the porch. She wrapped her shawl tighter around herself against the chill. "You're thinking awful hard out here," she said softly. He half smiled. "Seems to be all I do lately." She sat beside him, her arm pressing against his. "It's your choice, Roy, not his, not Buckner's, yours." He nodded, but said nothing. In the distance, a lone coyote howled. Roy just kept staring out into the dark, trying to find the answer in the emptiness. Back in my office, Tommy had fallen asleep in the chair, his breathing slow and steady. I leaned back in mine, staring at the ceiling. Maybe he was right. Maybe I did live too much inside my rule book. But what he didn't understand was that the rules were the only thing keeping men like me from turning into men like him. And that was a line I wasn't willing to cross. Not yet, anyway. I had my suspicions about Big Ernie the moment he set foot in town. There was something about the way he carried himself. Too smooth, too sure. Like a man who never heard the word no in his life. Folks around here might be honest, hard-working, and sometimes too trusting for their own good. But I wasn't about to let some slick-talking outsider waltz in and make fools of them. Ernie arrived on a Thursday afternoon, stepping off the train dressed like a man who had never worked a day in his life. His suit was crisp, his shoes shined so bright I could see my own scowl in them. The air carried the scent of pork chops frying over at Lil's diner, but it did little to ease the tension I felt knotting in my gut. By the time I made my way down Main Street, Ernie had already started making his rounds, shaking hands, slapping backs, and tossing around promises like feed to a hungry flock. I spotted him through the window of Wilson's general store, talking low and earnest to old Roy Wilson himself. Roy, bless him, always had the backbone of a damp biscuit. And if Ernie had set his sights on him first, I figured he knew exactly what he was doing. I pushed open the door, the bell jangling overhead. "Afternoon, Roy. Big Ernie." Roy jumped like I'd caught him with his hand in the till. "Sheriff Buckner, didn't see you there." Ernie turned to face me, all smooth charm and gleaming teeth. "Sheriff, a pleasure. Heard a lot about you." "Can't say I can return the favor." I didn't offer my hand. He let his hang in the air a beat too long before withdrawing it with a chuckle. "Just getting to know the fine folks of your town. I believe in progress, Sheriff. Opportunity. I think we could do some real good here." "That right?" I kept my tone even. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Roy answered before Ernie could. "Now, Buckner, let's not be hasty. He's just talkin' is all. We haven't agreed to anything." That told me everything I needed to know. "You thinking about it, Roy?" "Well, He's a smart man," Ernie interrupted smoothly. "Thinks about things before making a decision. That's a sign of a good businessman." Roy puffed up a little at that, but his nervous eyes flicked to me, looking for reassurance. I gave him none. "I've been in law enforcement long enough to know a smooth talker when I see one," I said, leveling my gaze at Ernie. "And I also know that not all business is good business." "Now, Sheriff," Ernie said with an easy laugh, "that's not very welcoming of you. I thought this town believed in giving people a chance. We give honest men a chance, jury's still out on you." That wiped the smile off his face for just a second before it returned, forced and thin. "I'd hate to think you're trying to stifle opportunity here. I'd hate to think you're trying to take advantage of my people." There was a long pause. Then Ernie turned back to Roy, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'll let you think on it, Roy. No rush." I saw Roy swallow hard, nodding like a man who wished the ground would open up beneath him. When Ernie finally left, I turned to Roy, arms crossed. "Want to tell me what that was about?" Roy ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Buckner, I don't know." He's talking about development, investment, bringing money into town. Says he's got connections. And you believe him? Roy hesitated. I don't know what to believe. I let out a slow breath, forcing my frustration down. Listen to me, Roy. Men like Ernie don't give without taking twice as much. You don't owe him a thing. Roy nodded, but I could tell it didn't sink in deep enough. He was scared, and scared men made poor decisions. I left the store and headed to Lil's diner, where I found Lil behind the counter, wiping down a coffee cup with a vengeance. I take it you heard? I asked, sliding onto a stool. Heard, saw, and I'm about ready to throw Roy in the river, she snapped. How in the hell does a man who's been in business for 30 years let himself get roped in by some snake oil salesman? He's scared, I said simply. Scared people don't always think straight. Lil scowled. Well, I'm scared too, Buckner. I got a business to run, just like Roy. I don't need some fancy-dressed grifter coming in here making promises he won't keep. I agree. She narrowed her eyes at me. Good. Then do something about it. I leaned forward. Like what, Lil? I can't arrest him for talking. You can make it clear he's not welcome. Oh, I already did. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good. But if Roy caves, that's it. You know how this town works. If one person signs up, the rest follow like sheep. I know. I pushed back from the counter. I'll handle it. Lil didn't look convinced. You'd better. Otherwise, we're all in trouble. I left the diner with my mind made up. Big Ernie thought he could waltz in and sweet-talk his way into our town, but he hadn't met me yet. He was about to learn that Sheriff Buckner didn't take kindly to strangers with empty promises. And he sure as hell didn't let wolves slip into the fold without a fight. I stood at the front of the crowded town hall, my hands resting on my belt, fingers drumming against the worn leather as the people of Mill Creek packed in. The old wooden beams overhead groaned under the weight of another gathering, another debate over what some folks called progress. To me, it was something else entirely. All right, settle down, I said, voice carrying over the murmurs. We all know why we're here. Might as well get to it. Lil Mercer, sharp-eyed and quick-tongued as ever, stood before the assembly. She always had that fire about her, a determination that folks either admired or resented. She wasted no time. We need to move forward, Sheriff, she said, scanning the crowd for allies. Mill Creek can't stay frozen in time. We need the new highway connection, better infrastructure, and modern businesses. The world's moving on, and we can't just dig our heels in and pretend it ain't happening. I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. And what? Turn this town into another stop along the way for tourists? Fill our streets with people who don't belong? Lose everything that makes this place what it is? A few folks nodded. Others grumbled. My voice grew stronger. I know what they say about me, about how I cling to the past. But I ain't doing this for myself. I'm doing it for Mill Creek. The way I see it, progress ain't always good. We tear down the old to make way for the new, and before you know it, you don't recognize your own home anymore. Lil huffed. You always bring up home, Sheriff, but whose home are you really talking about? Because I remember a time when you fought for this town to be better. Now every time someone brings up change, you're first in line to fight it. The tension was thick. I glanced at Roy, who stood off to the side, silent as always. He was caught between us, between what was and what could be. A man who didn't take sides until there was no choice left. Darla stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the room like a blade through old rope. Maybe the real question is, Sheriff, what are you really fighting for? Is it the town, or is it you? I stiffened. Darla had a way of getting under my skin. She knew how to make a man question himself, and I didn't much like that. What the hell is that supposed to mean? She crossed her arms, eyes steady. I mean, you act like modernizing Mill Creek is some kind of attack on tradition, but maybe you're just scared. Scared of what happens when the past ain't enough to hold on to anymore. Scared of what comes next. A murmur rippled through the crowd. My jaw tightened. You don't know me, Darla. I know enough, she shot back. I know you've been sheriff here longer than some of us have been alive. I know you fought for this town when no one else would. And I know that sometimes the past feels safer than the future. I let out a breath, slow and steady. And what happens when we change so much we don't even recognize ourselves? What happens when everything we held on to, everything that made Mill Creek home, is gone? Lil sighed. That ain't gonna happen, Buck. But refusing to change don't mean we're keeping what we love. It just means we're falling behind. I looked out over the faces before me, some loyal, some uncertain, some eager for something I wasn't sure I could give. The weight of years pressed down on me. Maybe Darla was right. Maybe I was afraid. But fear wasn't enough to make me back down. I straightened my back. I'll tell you one thing. We don't make decisions lightly in Mill Creek. We don't just hand over our town to people who don't know a damn thing about it. You want change? Then prove it's worth it. Otherwise, I ain't budging. The room buzzed with voices, debates sparking again. Roy met my eyes. Something unreadable there. Maybe he saw what I couldn't yet. As the meeting carried on, I realized this fight wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. But I wasn't ready to let go just yet. It was just past midnight when I got the call. Another crash, another mess, another damn mistake Tommy had made. Sheriff, it's bad this time, Deputy Willis said over the radio. He plowed right into the diner. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my coat. The old radio buzzed as I responded. Any injuries? Not in the building. Just Tommy. Banged up pretty bad, but he's breathing. I threw my truck into gear and sped down Main Street, where the flashing red and blue lights painted the familiar buildings in streaks of urgency. The front of the diner, Marge's place, looked like it had taken a mortar shell. Glass was everywhere, bricks knocked loose from the impact. Tommy's truck, an old red Ford, had embedded itself halfway into the dining area. The neon sign flickered pathetically. Marge's, now reading as Marge, with a few sparks popping from the tubing. Darla stood outside, arms crossed, shaking her head. Her face was tight with frustration, her stance unmovable. I walked past her, straight to where Willis was pulling Tommy from the cab. Blood dripped from his temple, his eyes unfocused, the unmistakable stench of whiskey on his breath. I clenched my jaw so tight I could feel my teeth grind. "Get him to the station," I ordered. Willis hesitated. "Sheriff, he needs a doctor. He needs a damn wake-up call." Tommy groaned as we pulled him to his feet. His legs wobbled, his head lolled. "Sheriff," he slurred. "Didn't see it. Didn't mean—" "I don't want to hear it, Tommy. Not this time." Marge came out from the side of the wreck, her apron still on, her hands shaking. "Jesus, Buckner, what are you gonna do about this?" "Gonna lock him up," I said. "Throw the damn book at him." "That's what you always say," Darla snapped. Her voice cut through the cold air, sharper than the shattered glass at our feet. I turned to face her. "Excuse me? You think this is just about Tommy making bad choices? That throwing him in a cell's gonna fix what's wrong?" I narrowed my eyes. "He's a menace, Darla. Every time we cut him slack, he screws up again. How many times has it been?" She shook her head. "That's not how addiction works, Buckner. You keep acting like this is just about personal responsibility when it's bigger than that. It's a disease." I scoffed. "A disease that puts my town in danger. A disease that could have killed someone tonight." She stepped closer, not backing down. "And what do you think locking him up's gonna do? Scare him straight? You think he hasn't felt ashamed, hasn't wanted to do better? It doesn't work that way." I felt my blood heat up. "So what? We just let him off?" "No," she said, voice firm. "But you need to stop pretending punishment is the only answer." I looked at Tommy, barely able to hold himself up as Willis steadied him. His face was gaunt, his hands trembling. The Tommy I used to know, the one who worked hard, laughed easy, was long gone. This man was a ghost of himself, drowning in something he couldn't escape. I ran a hand down my face, exhaling hard. "Then what do you propose?" She folded her arms. "Rehab, real rehab. Not just a few days drying out in a cell. And when he gets out, support. People like Tommy don't get better when they're just thrown away. They need a reason to try." I looked at the wreckage, at Marge, still in shock, at my deputy holding up a man I barely recognized anymore. I let out a long breath and nodded. "All right, let's try it your way." I knew something was about to go down the moment I stepped onto Main Street that evening. A storm was rolling in, dark clouds hanging low over Winston's meats, the smell of raw meat and sawdust wafting from inside. The whole damn town had been waiting on Roy to make his decision. and it seemed Big Ernie had grown tired of waiting. Big Ernie was a force, the kind of man who walked into a room and made it smaller just by being there. And now he had Roy pinned in the back of the butcher's shop, the cleaver on the wooden block between them gleaming under the single overhead light. "Time's up, Roy," Big Ernie growled. "You know what happens to a man who don't make a choice." Roy, pale as the butcher paper stacked in the corner, swallowed hard. He wasn't a coward, not exactly, but he'd never been good at standing his ground, always wavering, always second-guessing. And in a town like ours, that kind of man didn't last long. I stepped forward, my spurs clicking against the tile floor, and tilted my hat up. "Now, Ernie," I said, my voice calm but firm. "This ain't the way to go about it." Ernie turned to me, his jaw working like he was chewing on gravel. "Stay out of this, Buckner. This is between me and Roy." I shook my head. "No, Ernie, it ain't. It's between Roy and himself. Ain't no man can force another to make a choice before he's ready." The butcher shop was quiet except for the slow, steady drip of blood from a fresh-cut slab of beef. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on Roy, the walls closing in, the choice tightening around his throat like a noose. And then Lil spoke. "Why does my husband need permission from every man in this town to live his life?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the thick air like a knife. She stood in the doorway, her hands on her hips, her dark eyes burning with a fury I hadn't seen before. Lil wasn't one to raise her voice, but when she did, you damn sure listened. Big Ernie turned to her, frowning. "Lil, this ain't—" "This ain't what? My business? My life?" She stepped forward, pushing past me, past the counter, standing right next to Roy. "I'm sick of this town deciding things for us. Sick of waiting for Roy to make a decision when half the time it's you men making it for him." Roy flinched, the shame creeping into his face. I could see him crumbling under the weight of it all. The man just wanted to live his life, but in Winston, your life was never just your own. Big Ernie exhaled through his nose, crossing his arms. "The world don't work like that, Lil." "Well, maybe it should," she shot back. I studied Roy then, watching the way his shoulders slumped, the way his fingers twitched at his sides. I knew he was thinking about running, about bolting right out of that butcher shop and never looking back. But Roy had been running his whole life, and sooner or later a man had to stand. "You gotta decide, Roy," I said, keeping my voice steady. "One way or another." Roy looked at me, then at Big Ernie, then at Lil. His chest rose and fell, his breath shaky. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't ready. Maybe he'd never be ready. "I can't," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Big Ernie's lips pressed into a thin line. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Then you just made your choice." The words were heavy, final. I felt the shift in the air like the moment before a gunfight when you know there's no going back. Roy had chosen not to choose, and in this town that was as good as throwing in the towel. Lil let out a breath, shaking her head. "Damn you, Roy." She turned on her heel and strode out, her boots striking hard against the floor. Roy didn't move, didn't call after her. He just stood there, lost, drowning in the weight of his own indecision. Big Ernie gave me a look, one that told me this wasn't over. Then he walked past me, leaving the butcher shop and stepping out into the night. I stood there for a long moment, watching Roy, waiting to see if there was anything left in him worth saving. But he didn't move. He just stared at that cleaver on the block, frozen in place. Some men were meant to lead. Some were meant to follow. And some, like Roy, were just meant to fade away. I always knew Tommy had a wild streak. Some men carry their burdens with a bowed head, grinding through life's troubles with little more than a grimace. Not Tommy. He fought his pain the way a drunk fights a bottle, by diving headfirst into it and refusing to come up for air. So when word came down that Tommy had gone missing after another one of his whiskey-fueled escapades, I didn't think much of it at first. Wasn't the first time he'd wandered off. Hell, I'd dragged him out of the woods more times than I cared to count, half frozen, half starved, and muttering nonsense about ghosts and regrets. But something about this time felt different. Maybe it was the way Sally, his sister, had called me near tears, or the way the morning sun filtered through the pines in an eerie sort of way, as if the town itself knew something was off. I rubbed a hand over my face, leaning against my squad car outside the station. "You seen Tommy?" I asked Bill Lacey, one of the regulars outside the diner. "Not since 2 nights ago," Bill said, stuffing tobacco into his lip. "Was at Jeb's, drinking his weight in bad choices." That didn't narrow it down much. Jeb's place was the last stop for a man looking to drown his sorrows, and Tommy had more than most. I thanked Bill and made my way over, the gravel crunching under my boots as I pulled up outside the bar. Inside, the place smelled of stale beer and regret. Jeb was behind the bar, polishing a glass with the kind of dedication only a man who didn't want to talk could muster. "Tommy been in?" I asked, sliding onto a stool. "Yeah," Jeb grunted, not looking up. "Left about midnight. Said he was going to clear his head." "Which direction?" Jeb finally met my eyes. "Toward the old dam." My stomach sank. The old dam had been sitting abandoned for years, half crumbling, half forgotten. It was the kind of place only teenagers and lost souls ventured to. I got back in my car and headed out, the unease growing with every mile. The road leading to the dam was rough, the kind that rattled your teeth and made you wonder if the thing had been paved in another lifetime. The woods were thick out here, pressing in close, as if they wanted to swallow whatever poor fool wandered in. I found his truck parked haphazardly near the dam's entrance, the driver's side door hanging open. Not a good sign. I killed the engine and stepped out, my hand resting on the butt of my gun as I called out, "Tommy." Silence. Damn fool. If he'd fallen in or gotten himself lost, I'd never hear the end of it from Sally. I moved closer, stepping over broken branches and crunching dead leaves underfoot. The dam loomed ahead, its concrete body scarred by time and neglect. And then I saw it, a boot print in the mud leading toward the water's edge. I followed it, my gut twisting tighter with every step. The air smelled wrong, like damp rot and something else I couldn't place. Then I saw the jacket, a beat-up denim thing Tommy never went without, draped over a fallen log. No sign of Tommy, though. Damn it, Tommy, I muttered, picking up the jacket. The fabric was damp, but not soaked through. Maybe he'd just wandered off, found a dry place to sleep it off. I was about to turn back when a noise stopped me cold. A rustling, low and deliberate, from the trees beyond. I drew my gun. Who's there? No answer. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no insects, just that damn rustling. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I stood there for a long minute before slowly lowering my gun. "You're losing it, Buckner," I muttered, shaking my head. I searched for another hour before giving up. Tommy was gone, but he hadn't just vanished. Something had happened here, and I aimed to find out what. Back in town, things were brewing on a different front. Big Ernie had made his move. "I'm building that supermarket," Ernie declared, standing outside the hardware store with a group of his yes-men nodding behind him. "Don't care if Roy sells or not. That lot's got space, and if I gotta go around him, I will." Roy Pritchard owned the last bit of land standing between Ernie and his so-called progress. A stubborn old bastard. Roy wasn't the type to be bullied. But Ernie had money, power, and more nerve than sense. I stepped onto the sidewalk. "You making threats, Ernie?" Ernie grinned. "Just stating facts, Sheriff. You keep stating 'em like that, I might have to take more interest in your business." He chuckled, clapping a hand on my shoulder as if we were old friends. "Now, Buckner, you know as well as I do this town needs growth. A supermarket brings jobs, convenience. You gonna stand in the way of that?" I looked him square in the eye. "I'm gonna stand in the way of you steamrolling folks who ain't interested in selling." Ernie's grin didn't fade, but his eyes hardened. "We'll see about that." I watched as he walked away, his entourage following like shadows. This town was changing, whether we liked it or not, and somewhere out there Tommy was still missing. The dam had cracked, and I had a feeling it wasn't just the concrete one in the woods. The real break was coming, and when it did, there'd be no stopping the flood. I had been sheriff of this town long enough to know when someone was running. Trouble has a way of leaving footprints even in the dark, and Tommy's were easy to follow. Darla and I had been looking for him all day, checking the usual haunts. The bar on Main Street where he'd racked up a tab he'd never pay. The rundown trailer where his cousin let him crash when things got bad. Even the old quarry where teenagers went to get into the kind of trouble they weren't supposed to. But Tommy wasn't in any of those places. It wasn't until we stood outside his father's abandoned house that I knew, deep down, this was where we'd find him. The place had been empty for years, the windows shattered by rocks and time. The paint peeled off the siding like old skin, and the porch sagged under the weight of lost memories. But I remembered it when it wasn't like this. Back when Tommy's father, Hank, still lived there, before drinking himself into an early grave. Darla looked at me, her brown eyes filled with concern. "You sure he's here?" I nodded. If I was him, this is where I'd go. We stepped onto the porch, and the wood groaned beneath our feet. I knocked on the door, knowing it wasn't locked. "Tommy, it's Sheriff Buckner. Open up." No answer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, Darla close behind me. The air smelled like mildew and stale beer, a familiar scent in a place like this. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the thin beams of moonlight slipping through the broken windows. Then we saw him. Tommy sat on the floor in the corner, knees pulled to his chest. An empty bottle rolled near his boot, the amber liquid inside long gone. His face was a mess of stubble and exhaustion, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were hollow, lost. "Go away," he muttered, turning his head away like a child caught doing something wrong. I exhaled slowly, stepping forward. "Can't do that, son," he scoffed. "Ain't your problem, Sheriff. Ain't nobody's problem but mine." Darla crossed her arms. "You really believe that?" He didn't answer. I crouched down in front of him, my knees popping in protest. "Tommy, we've been looking for you all day. Your mama's worried sick. You been drinking?" He let out a bitter laugh. "What do you think?" I looked around the room, at the faded wallpaper curling at the corners, at the old recliner covered in dust. The ghosts of bad memories lingered in every shadow, and I knew this was more than just a place to hide. This was the last place he'd ever been happy. "I used to come here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Back when my old man was still around. He'd be passed out in his chair and I'd steal a few sips of his whiskey. Thought I was a man." He rubbed his face, his fingers shaking. "Now look at me. Just like him." "No," I said firmly. "You're not." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in his eyes cracked. "How do you know? How do you know I ain't just gonna drink myself into the dirt like he did?" I didn't have an easy answer for that. I wasn't a preacher, wasn't a counselor. Hell, I wasn't even sure I was a good lawman most days. But I knew Tommy, and I knew he was more than just his father's son. "You want to quit?" I asked. He laughed again, but this time there was no humor in it, just pain. "Course I do, but I don't know how." His shoulders shook, and for the first time I saw it, raw, desperate vulnerability, the kind that don't come easy to a man, especially one like Tommy. I swallowed hard. "It ain't easy, but it's possible." He wiped his eyes roughly, embarrassed. What do I do? I looked over at Darla. She'd been quiet, letting me do the talking. But now she knelt down beside him, her voice gentle. First thing, you don't do it alone. He sniffed, nodding slowly. I ran a hand over my jaw, feeling the weight of my own words. I'd spent my life thinking that law and order was black and white, that folks like Tommy made their choices and had to live with them. But looking at him now, I saw something I hadn't let myself see before. He was scared, and so damn tired. Maybe I'd been too hard. Maybe my rigid ways had made it worse, made men like Tommy feel like they were past saving. Maybe it was time I took a hard look in the mirror, too. I stood up, reaching out a hand. Come on, Tommy, let's get you out of here. He hesitated, but then took my hand, letting me pull him to his feet. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The morning air carried the scent of fresh rain, mixing with the familiar dust and hay of our small town. It was one of those days where things felt poised on the edge of change. I stepped out onto the station's wooden porch, the floorboards creaking beneath my boots. It had been a long night, and I had a feeling today was going to be longer. Tommy had been locked up in the county jail for a week now, drunk and disorderly, resisting arrest. Nothing we hadn't seen before. But this time, something gnawed at me about the whole situation. Tommy wasn't just some troublemaker. He was lost, stuck in a cycle, and if I didn't do something about it, he'd be back in that cell sooner or later. As I lit a cigarette, thinking about how to handle it, Lil Monroe came striding up the steps. Her red curls bounced with each determined step, and she had that look in her eye, the one that told me she was about to rattle my morning quiet. Roy ain't selling, she said. No pleasantries, no build-up, just straight to the point. You can go ahead and spread the word, Sheriff. I exhaled, shaking my head. And you're telling me this because... She crossed her arms. Because Roy ain't got it in him to say it himself, and Ernie needs to hear it from someone who won't back down. I chuckled. So that's you, huh? She smirked. Damn right it is. Roy Pearson had been wavering on whether to sell his land for weeks now, ever since Ernie Thompson started poking around with a briefcase full of numbers and promises. Roy wasn't a man built for hard decisions. He'd hem and haw, think himself into circles, and by the time he came close to a choice, he'd start doubting himself all over again. But Lil wasn't like that. She had a spine made of steel, and when she got an idea in her head, there was no budging her. It didn't surprise me one bit that she was the one delivering the news instead of Roy. Well, I'd say that's a load off, I said, flicking ash off the end of my cigarette. Ernie's not going to be happy. Lil snorted. Ernie's a snake. He'll move on. I nodded, knowing she was right. Ernie wasn't the type to dwell on a lost deal. He'd just slither on to the next opportunity. But that was Roy's business. Mine was Tommy. I walked down to the jailhouse, Lil keeping pace beside me, her business with me clearly unfinished. "You're thinking about letting Tommy out, aren't you?" she asked, her voice sharp with curiosity. I stopped in my tracks and looked at her. "Not exactly. I'm thinking about getting him help. Real help." She narrowed her eyes. "Since when did you start believing in second chances, Sheriff?" I sighed. "Since I got tired of seeing the same damn people go through those jail doors over and over again." Lil didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right. What do you have in mind?" "There's a place over in the next county," I said. "A real treatment center, not just a holding cell. Tommy's got a problem, and locking him up ain't fixing it. If we don't do something different, he's gonna drink himself into an early grave." Lil considered that. "And you think the town's gonna go for it?" "No," I admitted, "but I don't much care what the town thinks." She grinned. "Now that's the Sheriff Buckner I know." I pushed open the door to the jailhouse, stepping inside the dimly lit office. Tommy was slumped on the cot in his cell, arms crossed, staring at the ceiling like he was counting the cracks in the plaster. "Tommy," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. He sat up, blinking at me. "You finally come to kick me loose?" "No," I said. "I came to offer you something better." He scoffed. "Ain't nothing better coming for me, Sheriff. I think we both know that." "I don't believe that," I said, stepping closer to the bars. "You've got a chance here, Tommy. A real one. There's a place that can help you, if you let it. But you've got to want it." He laughed, but there wasn't any joy in it. "And what if I don't?" "Then you sit right there and wait for the next time I have to drag you in," I said. "And the time after that, until there ain't no more times left." He stared at me, and for the first time in a long time I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that looked an awful lot like fear. Lil, standing behind me, crossed her arms. "He's right, Tommy. This town's done watching you drink yourself to death. You either take the help or you keep killing yourself. Your choice." He swallowed, looking down at his hands. The room was silent for a long time. Then finally he nodded. "All right, I'll go." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Good," I said. "Let's get you out of here." Lil shot me a look as Tommy stood up. "Looks like today's a day for decisions after all." I smirked. "Guess so. The world don't change much in a town like mine. Folks wake up, work their land, and close the day with a beer on their porches. It's been that way since before my granddaddy wore the badge. I never thought much about change, never wanted it, and sure as hell never asked for it. But life has a way of slapping you upside the head when you least expect it. And that slap came hard this week. It started with Tommy. The kid had been trouble since he was old enough to drive. I'd picked him up more times than I could count. Public intoxication, disorderly conduct, a few close calls with real trouble. But deep down, I always knew there was a good kid under all that mess. Maybe it was because I'd known his daddy. a man who fought his own demons before they finally got the better of him. Last Friday night, Tommy stumbled into my office, reeking of booze and regret. He slumped into the chair across from me, rubbing his temples like he was trying to squeeze out whatever pain was inside his head. "I can't do it no more, Sheriff," he mumbled. "I need help." That wasn't a sentence I expected to hear from Tommy Dunn. Usually he had some excuse, some wisecrack, some way to shift the blame. But not this time. His hands shook, his eyes were bloodshot, and there was a weight on his shoulders that no boy his age should carry. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. "Rehab," I said. "It ain't easy. Neither is drinking myself to death." I let out a long sigh. "All right, Tommy, let's get you some help." And just like that, something shifted. I made a few calls, pulled a few favors, and 2 days later I drove him to a facility 2 towns over. He didn't say much on the ride, and neither did I. When we got there, he turned to me, his jaw clenched like he was trying to keep from falling apart. "You think I can do this?" "That's up to you, kid, but I sure as hell hope so." For the first time in a long while, Tommy didn't have a smart-ass reply. He just nodded, grabbed his bag, and walked through those doors. I sat in my cruiser for a long while before heading back to town. Maybe folks can change, maybe. But if there was one thing I was sure would never change, it was Roy and Lil's shop. The place had been standing since the 50s, a relic of another time. Roy's daddy built it, and Roy took it over without changing a damn thing. The aisles were narrow, the shelves were wooden, and the cash register was older than I was. It was the kind of place where people still signed their names in a ledger if they wanted to put something on credit. So you can imagine my surprise when I walked in and saw Roy standing behind a brand new counter with one of those computer screens in front of him. "The hell is that?" I grumbled, pointing at the thing like it was about to grow legs and walk away. Lil laughed from behind the counter. "That's called progress, Sheriff. You ought to try it sometime." Roy, who had been more stubborn than a mule his entire life, just shrugged. "Lil talked me into it. Says folks these days don't carry cash no more. Gotta keep up if we want the shop to stick around." I looked around. The place still smelled the same, like old wood and fresh coffee. The shelves were still packed with the same supplies, the same knickknacks, the same jars of penny candy that probably cost a nickel now. Yeah, there was a new counter and a computer, but everything else? It was still Roy and Lil's shop, still the heart of this town. "Damn shame," I muttered, but I knew deep down it wasn't. Roy grinned. "Don't worry, Buckner. We ain't changing everything. Just what we have to." That stuck with me. Maybe change didn't have to mean tearing everything down and starting over. Maybe it just meant making room for something new while holding on to what mattered. The thought nagged at me all the way home. And by the time I sat down with a beer on my porch, I had to admit something I never thought I would. Maybe, just maybe, some rules could be bent. some things could change. Not that I was about to say it out loud. Hell no. Instead, I took a sip of my beer, let out a long breath, and muttered to no one in particular, I still don't like it. Meet the truth. The moment my car sputtered and rolled to an unceremonious stop, I knew the day had taken a turn for the worse. You have got to be kidding me, I muttered, gripping the steering wheel of my immaculate luxury sedan, the one thing in my life that was supposed to be dependable. I checked my watch. 35 minutes until my meeting. Plenty of time if I got a tow truck here now. I grabbed my phone and dialed my assistant, who picked up on the second ring. Arthur? Her voice was cautious, already bracing for my irritation. My car just died on me. I'm stranded in the middle of nowhere and I need a tow truck. Now. Where are you exactly? I glanced out the windshield. The street was lined with buildings that had seen better days. Brick facades darkened with years of grime, worn-out awnings flapping in the breeze. The only sign of life was a stray cat slinking behind a dumpster. Some run-down part of town, I snapped. Find a service near, wherever this is. Send them now. I'll handle it, but it might take some time to... Just get it done, I said, ending the call before she could finish whatever excuse she was about to make. Sitting in my car felt like defeat, so I stepped out, the stale city air meeting me with an uninviting embrace. I scanned the street and spotted a storefront a few doors down. Rustic, but with enough charm to suggest it might be a high-end deli, someplace where I could get a decent espresso while waiting for the tow truck. I strode across the cracked pavement and pulled open the door, expecting gleaming glass cases filled with imported cheeses and dry-aged meats. Instead, I was greeted by the overwhelming scent of metal, oil, and something distinctly damp. The place was not a deli. It was a plumbing supply shop. A burly man behind the counter looked up from a newspaper, eyes narrowing at me like I had walked into his living room uninvited. "Help you?" he grunted, setting down his coffee mug. It had a crude drawing of a cartoon wrench on it, the words, "Get a grip," emblazoned in faded lettering. I cleared my throat, debating whether I should just turn around and leave. But that would mean admitting I had made a mistake, and I never liked doing that. "Ah, no," I said smoothly, adjusting my cufflinks. I was under the impression this was a different kind of establishment. The man leaned on the counter, his thick forearms dusted with what I could only assume was grease. "Well, unless you're in the market for pipes or a new water heater, you might be lost." "Not lost," I corrected. "Just temporarily inconvenienced." "Uh-huh." He folded his arms, unimpressed. "Car trouble?" I sighed, hating the admission. "Yes, waiting on a tow." "That's so?" He nodded toward the window. "That your fancy car outside?" "It is. Probably electrical. These new ones always got computers running everything. One little thing goes wrong, whole thing shuts down. That's why I stick to an old truck. Won't leave me stranded. Fascinating, I said dryly, glancing around. The walls were lined with tools and fittings I couldn't name, shelves stacked high with copper pipes and mysterious parts. A fluorescent light flickered ominously. "Do you serve coffee?" He barked a laugh. "You're definitely lost. Name's Gus." I raised an eyebrow. "Arthur Langley." "Langley? Sounds fancy. You some kind of lawyer? Businessman?" "Ah." He didn't ask more, just nodded like that explained everything. "So, you just gonna stand there or you need something?" I exhaled sharply. "You wouldn't happen to know a good tow service, would you?" "Might," Gus said, scratching his chin. "Or I could take a look. I fix things." I stared at him, then at my car through the window. Letting a plumber work on my luxury vehicle felt like an unspeakable breach of logic. But given my current options, waiting indefinitely or taking a gamble, I found myself relenting. "Fine, but if you make it worse, I'll have your entire shop shut down." Gus grinned, completely unfazed. "Now that sounds like a deal. Let's take a look." I followed him outside, already wondering if I'd regret this decision. One thing was certain. This was not how my day was supposed to go. Walking into Marty's butcher shop was like stepping into another world, one filled with the rich aroma of smoked meats, sawdust on the floor, and the occasional sound of a cleaver meeting its mark. I had been meaning to stop by for weeks, ever since Gus mentioned that this place had the best cuts in town. I considered myself a man of refined taste, a connoisseur of all things gourmet, and naturally I assumed Marty's establishment was the kind of fine deli I had frequented in my travels. Oh, how mistaken I was. The moment I stepped inside, Marty, the shop's rotund and ever-jovial owner, looked up from his work behind the counter. He was wiping his hands on his already blood-stained apron, a wide grin plastered on his face. "Well, well, if it ain't a new face," he bellowed. "Welcome to Marty's. What can I getcha? A nice ribeye, a fresh rack of lamb, or are you more of a sausage fella?" I puffed up my chest, nodding sagely. "Ah, yes. I'm in search of the finest cuts, something truly exquisite. Aged to perfection, delicate marbling, a symphony of flavors just waiting to be unleashed. You know, the kind of thing a true gastronome would appreciate." Marty raised an eyebrow, exchanging an amused glance with Gus, who was already leaning against the counter, waiting for his order. Gus, a no-nonsense plumber with a permanent smirk, had clearly heard my ramblings before. "Arthur, you ever even been in a butcher shop before?" Gus asked, arms crossed. "Of course," I said, waving off his skepticism. "I've spent countless afternoons in the finest charcuteries, sampling only the best. Spanish jamon, Italian prosciutto, French saucisson. I have a rather distinguished palate." Marty chuckled. "That's so? Well then, you must know your meats, huh?" "Absolutely," I said with a confidence bordering on the absurd. "For instance, I only eat beef that's been aged at least 21 days. preferably Wagyu, or, if I must, a fine cut of prime Angus. Anything less is simply barbaric. Gus let out a snort. You hear that, Marty? Barbaric. Marty shook his head, clearly enjoying himself. Well, you're in luck, Arthur. I got a special cut today. It's a rare breed, a truly premium meat. We call it ground chuck. Gus burst out laughing, slapping his knee. Oh yeah, real high-class stuff, Arthur. Aged to perfection right there in Marty's fridge, wrapped up nice in butcher paper. I felt my face flush, but I refused to back down. Ah yes, ground chuck. A highly underrated delicacy when prepared correctly. One must truly understand the complexities of fat content to appreciate its depth. Marty grinned. And what fat ratio do you prefer then? I hesitated for a fraction of a second, just enough time for Gus to pounce. Come on, Arthur. You just said you were an expert. You gotta know your meat-to-fat ratio. I cleared my throat. Oh, well, naturally, I prefer an even 60-40 split. Gus clapped a hand over his mouth to stifle his laughter, while Marty shook his head in mock disappointment. 60-40, huh? Now that's a new one, Marty said, his eyes twinkling. Most folks go for 80-20 or maybe 70-30, but 60-40? That's a bold choice. Indeed, I said, desperately trying to recover. It's for those who truly appreciate a richer mouthfeel. Sure, Marty said, nodding along. And what's your preferred way to cook it, since you're an expert and all? Oh, well, a low and slow approach is always best, I said, nodding as if I had just revealed some ancient culinary secret. Preserving the integrity of the fat is paramount, you see. Marty leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. So you'd slow cook a burger patty? I hesitated again, and that was all Gus needed. Oh, this is good, Gus said, wiping a tear from his eye. Arthur here is gonna braise a burger. Marty laughed so hard his belly shook. A true visionary. I crossed my arms, trying to maintain what little dignity I had left. Well, not a burger per se, but for something as refined as, say, a gourmet meatball. Ah, yes, a gourmet meatball, Marty interrupted. The peak of fine dining. Gus was practically doubled over at this point. Marty, you gotta get this guy a job. You ever thought about taking on an apprentice? Marty grinned. Oh, I don't know. I'd hate to stifle such a prodigious talent. I sighed, realizing that I had walked into a trap of my own making. All right, fine, you've had your fun. Marty, still grinning, reached into his display case and pulled out a thick marbled cut of steak. Tell you what, Arthur, here's a real fine cut, a bone-in ribeye. You take this home, cook it up however you like, and come back when you're ready to talk real meat. I took the package, swallowing my pride. Deal. Gus patted me on the back as we walked out. Don't worry, Arthur. Everyone's got to start somewhere. I sighed. I just thought that you could bluff your way through a butcher shop. Gus finished for me, grinning. Yeah, we all saw that coming. As we walked down the street, I looked down at the ribeye in my hands. Maybe it was time to actually learn a thing or two about meat. But one thing was for certain. Next time I'd do my homework before stepping into Marty's shop again. I had always been good at talking my way out of trouble. At least, that's what I told myself. And for the most part, it had worked, until I met Gus and Marty. Gus was built like an ox, his arms thick as hams, with a permanent scowl that suggested he'd seen more trouble than I ever wanted to. Marty, on the other hand, was lean and wiry, with a grin that made me uneasy, the kind of man who found entertainment in watching someone else squirm, and that someone, at this moment, was me. It had started harmless enough. The three of us had been loitering outside the butcher's shop, chewing on the fat about things we knew little about. I had made some off-handed remark about how butchering wasn't as hard as people made it seem. A sharp knife, a steady hand. How difficult could it be? Gus's dark eyes narrowed. "You ever butcher anything, Arthur?" I hesitated for half a second, but in the world we lived in, that was too long. "Course I have," I lied, puffing out my chest. Marty's grin stretched wider. "That's so." He exchanged a glance with Gus, and I immediately knew I had walked into something I couldn't talk my way out of. "Then you won't mind showing us." Gus gestured toward the shop. "Mr. Connolly always needs help. Let's see what you got." I felt my stomach drop. "Well, it's been a while." Marty cut me off with a laugh. "Oh, don't be modest now, Arthur. Come on, let's see those butcher skills of yours." I was trapped. If I backed out now, they'd know I had been bluffing. My reputation, or what little of it I had, would be ruined. I swallowed hard and forced a grin. "Fine, lead the way." The moment we stepped into the butcher's shop, I knew I was in deep trouble. The air was thick with the metallic scent of raw meat. Hooks lined the walls, heavy with carcasses, and behind the counter, Mr. Connolly himself, a man with hands like leather and eyes that missed nothing, was busy slicing through a slab of beef. Marty wasted no time. "Arthur here says he's got a butcher's touch." Mr. Connolly raised an eyebrow. "That so?" Gus folded his arms across his chest. "We were hoping he could show us." The butcher eyed me for a long moment, then gave a grunt. "All right, then. Let's see what you can do." I forced my feet forward, feeling every step like a march toward doom. Mr. Connolly handed me a knife, long, sharp, and far too heavy in my untrained grip. "Take that side of beef," he instructed, pointing to a massive hunk of meat hanging from a hook. "Show us how you'd quarter it." I stared at the meat, my mind racing. I had no idea where to start. I gripped the knife awkwardly, pretending to inspect the cut like I knew what I was doing. Gus and Marty stood close, watching with barely contained amusement. I took a deep breath and made my first cut. It was immediately clear I had no idea what I was doing. The blade slipped against the tough muscle, barely making a dent. I adjusted my grip and tried again, but all I managed was a jagged gash that looked more like a wild animal had taken a swipe at it than a clean butcher's cut. Marty let out a whistle. "Well, now that's a technique I ain't never seen before." Gus shook his head. "You're butchering the butchering." Mr. Connolly frowned. "You sure you've done this before, boy?" I swallowed hard, my palms sweating. "Just a little out of practice," I mumbled, trying again. The knife caught on a tendon, jerking out of my grip and clattering to the floor. Marty howled with laughter. Gus let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. My face burned as I bent to retrieve the knife, my fingers trembling. Mr. Connolly exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed. "Give me that." He snatched the knife from my hands and in one swift motion sliced through the meat with the precision of a man who had done this his entire life. I watched, humiliated, as he expertly separated the cuts. It was like watching an artist at work, every movement smooth, practiced, efficient, a stark contrast to my clumsy fumbling. When he was done, he wiped the blade clean and set it down with a decisive thud. "You ever lie to me again, boy?" he said, his voice as sharp as the knife. "I'll make sure you're the one hanging on the hook next." I nodded quickly, swallowing down whatever excuse had been forming. There was no getting out of this one. I had been caught, plain and simple. Marty clapped me on the back, still grinning. "Well, Arthur, that was the best entertainment I've had in a while." Gus, still smirking, simply shook his head. "Maybe stick to running your mouth instead of a butcher's knife." I wanted to argue, to come up with some kind of clever retort, but there was nothing to say. I had been thoroughly humiliated, my bluff called out in the worst possible way. As we left the shop, I felt my ears burning with shame. I had learned my lesson the hard way. Some things you just couldn't fake. And butchering? That was definitely one of them. I should have known it was a bad idea the moment Gus slapped the enormous slab of beef onto the cutting board in front of me. The weight of it alone nearly sent the whole thing skidding off the counter. The knife he handed me was just as intimidating, long, gleaming, and absurdly sharp. "All right, Arthur," Gus said, arms crossed over his chest. "Let's see what you got." I adjusted my grip on the handle, trying to ignore the smirk creeping across Marty's face from the other side of the kitchen island. He leaned against the counter, his eyes flicking between me and the poor hunk of meat like he was watching an accident about to happen, but was too entertained to intervene. "Do you, have a game plan?" Marty asked, barely containing a chuckle. "A game plan? It's meat, not a football play," I shot back, trying to sound more confident than I felt. I had watched people cut meat before. How hard could it be? Just slice and dice, right? With a deep breath, I raised the knife and aimed for what I thought was a logical spot. The blade barely made contact before I realized just how stubbornly resistant raw meat could be. Instead of a clean, precise cut, I hacked at it like a lumberjack attacking a particularly angry tree. "Jesus, Arthur," Gus muttered. You trying to murder it twice?" I ignored him, repositioning the knife for another go. This time I pressed down harder. My fingers slipped against the handle as the meat wobbled under the pressure. Before I knew it, the knife skidded sideways, nearly taking my index finger along for the ride. "Whoa! Watch it!" Marty yelped, jerking back as if the bloodshed was inevitable. I managed to yank my hand away in time, my heart thudding in my chest. "Maybe," Gus said slowly, his eyebrows raised. "You wanna, I don't know, not die today?" "That's the goal," I muttered, shaking off my nerves. The meat, however, remained as uncooperative as ever. Determined not to let an inanimate object defeat me, I tried another angle. This time I applied slow, steady pressure, dragging the knife through what I assumed was the grain. A small sliver peeled away, but the rest of the beef remained stubbornly intact. "Nice. You cut about a postage stamp's worth," Marty observed dryly. I scowled and adjusted my grip again. This time I put a little too much force behind the cut. The knife sank in, and then, before I knew what was happening, the entire slab of meat lurched off the cutting board, flopped onto the counter, and with a wet slap landed right on the floor. Silence. For a full 5 seconds, none of us moved. The three of us just stared down at the ruined hunk of beef, now resting in what I could only assume was an impressive collection of crumbs, stray bits of parsley, and, God help me, something that looked suspiciously like a dust bunny. Marty was the first to break. A single snort of laughter escaped him before he clamped a hand over his mouth. His shoulders shook. Gus, ever the practical one, just sighed. "Arthur, what the hell was that?" I bent down and picked up the beef, holding it up like some kind of grotesque trophy. Gravity? That was it. Marty lost it completely, doubling over with laughter, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Oh man, that was beautiful. That was," he wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes. "That was the single worst attempt at butchering I have ever seen in my life." "It's not that bad," I grumbled, eyeing the meat, which now had an unmistakable speck of something on its surface. Dust? Dirt? A curse? I didn't know. "Not that bad," Gus repeated, looking personally offended. "Arthur, you just introduced that beef to the entire ecosystem of this kitchen floor." I tried brushing off whatever debris clung to it, but it was no use. This thing was done for. "So," I said, clearing my throat, "hypothetically speaking, if one were to, salvage this—" "One would not," Gus interrupted flatly. Marty, still giggling, pointed at the garbage bin. "Send it to its grave, man. It's over." With a sigh, I dropped the disgraced slab into the trash. "Well," I said, "at least we have more, right?" Gus turned to the counter and gestured to the second piece of beef, still mercifully untouched. "Yeah, but I'm cutting this one. Probably for the best." Marty, finally regaining some control over himself, clapped me on the shoulder. "Arthur, my man, you are a disaster, but I'll give you points for effort." "Effort doesn't put dinner on the table," Gus muttered, already slicing into the new slab with an ease that made me seethe with envy. I crossed my arms and leaned against the counter, watching him work. I loosened it up for you. Marty chuckled. Yeah, sure, buddy. Gus didn't even look up. Next time, stick to eating, not cutting. I sighed, defeated. Maybe butchering wasn't my thing. Maybe I'd never master the fine art of slicing meat like a professional. But as Marty and Gus continued laughing at my expense, I had a feeling that even if my knife skills were horrendous, I'd at least provided them with a good story to tell for years to come. And, well, that was worth something. I should have seen it coming. In hindsight, the whole thing played out like a slow-motion car wreck. One of those moments you watch helplessly as it unfolds, knowing you're about to crash and there's nothing you can do about it. Except, in my case, I wasn't behind the wheel of some speeding car. I was in the back room of Marty's garage, running my mouth like I always did, and Gus was about to slam the brakes on me so hard I'd be tasting my own words for weeks. It all started with a stupid bet. Not a real bet, not one where money was on the line, but one of those unspoken, ego-fueled competitions that guys like us got into. The three of us, Gus, Marty, and me, had been hanging out in Marty's garage, half listening to the sound of rain pelting the tin roof while we worked on Marty's old dirt bike. It was supposed to be a simple fix, something about the carburetor or the spark plug, but somewhere along the way I started talking. And once I started, I didn't stop. I don't know what it is about me. Maybe it's a nervous thing, or maybe I just like the sound of my own voice too much. But I always have to prove I know things, even if I don't. And that was exactly what got me into trouble that night. The problem's not the plug, I said, leaning over the bike like I actually knew what I was looking at. It's gotta be the fuel line. You ever notice how the engine stutters before it dies? That's classic fuel starvation. I had the same issue on my uncle's bike a couple years ago. He almost junked it, but I fixed it myself. That was a lie. I had never fixed anything in my life. My uncle didn't even own a bike. But the words rolled out so smoothly that even I started believing them. Marty wiped his hands on a dirty rag and raised an eyebrow. Yeah, then why don't you fix it? That was the moment I should have backed down. I should have laughed it off, made some joke, or maybe even admitted I didn't really know. But I didn't. My pride had me in a chokehold. All right, move over, I said, reaching for the toolbox like I had any business being near it. I picked up a wrench and started messing with the bike, twisting bolts, poking at wires, basically making things worse. I could feel Gus watching me, could sense the weight of his stare, but I kept going, pretending I knew exactly what I was doing. Until, of course, I didn't. I don't know what I loosened, but something hissed, something clattered, and the next thing I knew I was on my back, staring at the ceiling while the bike slumped over like a drunk. A hot wave of embarrassment crawled up my neck. Marty burst out laughing, but it was Gus who got me. Jesus, Arthur, he said, shaking his head. He wasn't mad. That was the worst part. He just sounded disappointed. He leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, waiting. I scrambled to my feet, brushing off my jeans like I hadn't just made a complete fool of myself. I wasn't feeling well, I blurted. Been under the weather all day, probably why my hand slipped. Gus just stared at me. Marty had stopped laughing, looking between the two of us like he knew something was about to go down. The air in the garage felt heavier, thick with the scent of oil and humiliation. Gus sighed. Arthur, he said, voice level, you don't need to know everything. Just know when to shut up and listen. I felt like I had been punched. Not physically, but something about those words hit deeper than any fist could. I opened my mouth, but for the first time in my life, nothing came out. He wasn't trying to humiliate me. He wasn't angry, wasn't rubbing it in. He was just telling me the truth. And that truth was harder to swallow than any lie I had ever told. Silence stretched between us. Marty fidgeted with a wrench, pretending not to look at me. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to say anything. But the thing was, Gus was right. I ran my mouth too much. I got myself into messes I didn't need to be in. And for what? To look smart? To impress people who already knew exactly who I was? I wasn't sure what to do next. My instinct was to crack a joke, to shake it off and pretend like it didn't matter. But it did matter. I could feel it settling in my chest, this gnawing realization that maybe, just maybe, I needed to change. Gus pushed off the workbench and walked over to the bike, crouching beside it. Let's fix this the right way, he said, his voice softer now. You want to help, Arthur? Then watch and learn. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, and for once I did the one thing I never thought I was capable of. I shut up and listened. I stepped out of the dim, cluttered office with Gus at my side, still replaying our last exchange in my head. He had that infuriating way about him, like he saw right through me, through the careful way I positioned my words, through the quiet nods and feigned understanding. And worse, he found it amusing. You know, he said, nudging me with an elbow, you're too serious for a man your age. I frowned, adjusting the cuffs of my sleeves. I don't see what's so amusing. That's the problem, Gus chuckled, leading the way down the sidewalk. Come on, let's grab a bite. I know a place. I hesitated. Gus wasn't exactly the sort of person I usually took advice from, let alone followed to an unknown location. But something about the way he carried himself, a self-assuredness that didn't stem from arrogance, but rather from knowing himself completely, made me curious. So, against my better judgment, I followed him. The diner wasn't much to look at, a squat little building with sun-faded blinds and a hand-painted sign over the door. The kind of place where the coffee is always too strong and the booths are sticky from years of use. Gus pushed the door open, releasing a bell's cheerful jingle, and nodded at the waitress behind the counter. Ruby? he greeted, sliding into a booth. The usual. She gave him a knowing look and scribbled something on her notepad before disappearing into the back. I sat across from him, unsure what I'd just signed up for. "You come here often?" I asked, glancing around. The air smelled of bacon grease and freshly brewed coffee, and the low murmur of conversation filled the space. "Long enough that Ruby doesn't bother asking what I want." Gus leaned back, lacing his fingers over his stomach, which is how I like it. I studied him for a moment, trying to place him in a neat little category in my head, somewhere between old-fashioned and perpetually unimpressed. "Let me guess," I said. "You're one of those people who think modern life is too complicated, that we've all lost touch with the simple things." Gus grinned. "Something like that." The waitress returned, setting down 2 plates, one for Gus, filled with eggs, toast, and thick slices of ham, and one for me, a simple sandwich and fries. I hadn't ordered, but I supposed Gus had done it for me. "You strike me as a sandwich guy," he said with a wink. I raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. For a while we ate in silence. I had to admit the food was good. Simple, unpretentious, the kind of meal that didn't try too hard. Gus ate with the confidence of someone who enjoyed his food without overthinking it. "You know," he said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, "you remind me of someone I used to know." I looked up. "Oh? Yeah. A kid who thought he had to prove he was the smartest guy in the room, always talking, always trying to sound like he had all the answers." Gus tapped his fork against his plate. "Turns out people like that don't know a damn thing." I bristled. "And what makes you so sure I don't?" Gus chuckled. "Because if you did, you wouldn't feel the need to prove it." I sat back, chewing over his words along with my next bite of sandwich. It was the kind of statement that was too simple, too direct. And yet, it stuck. "You think intelligence is useless?" I asked. "Nah," Gus said. "I think pretending to be smart is useless." He took a sip of his coffee, watching me over the rim of the cup. "Experience, though. That's worth something. Humility, too." I exhaled sharply. That sounds like something someone who doesn't want to learn would say. Gus grinned, clearly enjoying himself. "And that sounds like something someone who's scared of being wrong would say." I opened my mouth to argue, but found myself hesitating. He wasn't entirely off the mark, and I hated that. Gus set his cup down. "Look, I ain't saying intelligence isn't important, but life has a funny way of humbling people who think they've got it all figured out. You ever notice the smartest people in the room don't always talk the most?" I thought about that. The professors I'd admired most, the mentors who carried an effortless wisdom, they were rarely the loudest voices. "Let me ask you something," Gus said, leaning in. "What's more useful, knowing 100 facts or knowing how to admit when you don't know something?" I frowned. "That depends." "No, it doesn't." Gus pointed a finger at me, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Because the guy who can admit he doesn't know something is the guy who's gonna learn the most. The guy who pretends to know, he's already stopped learning. I stared at him, the sandwich in my hand forgotten. Damn it, he had a point. I exhaled, shaking my head. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Gus laughed, a warm, rumbling sound. A little. For the rest of lunch, I let myself listen instead of argue. I let Gus tell his stories, some funny, some a little sad, all carrying that quiet wisdom that came from living rather than theorizing. And as much as I hated to admit it, I started to see the value in what he was saying. By the time the plates were empty and the coffee cups drained, I found myself a little less sure of my own certainty. Maybe Gus was right. Maybe being smart wasn't about knowing all the answers. Maybe it was about knowing when to listen. I should have known it was going to be one of those days the moment I turned the key in the ignition and heard nothing but a faint clicking sound. A dead battery? Maybe. Something worse? I had no idea. Cars had always been a mystery to me. Metal beasts powered by some mix of science and sorcery that I had never bothered to understand. I sighed and pulled out my phone. There was only one reasonable course of action. Call for a tow truck. You called for a tow? The driver asked when he arrived, stepping out of his truck with a clipboard in one hand and a coffee in the other. He looked at me, then at my car, then back at me with an expression that already made me feel ridiculous. Yeah, it just won't start, I admitted, crossing my arms. He walked over, lifted the hood, and peered inside for all of 10 seconds before chuckling. You don't need a tow, buddy. This is a 5-minute fix. I stared at him, baffled. What do you mean? Before he could answer, Gus arrived, grinning like he already knew the punchline to a joke I wasn't in on. Gus was one of those people who could build a house from scratch, fix anything with duct tape and determination, and always seemed to have a screwdriver in his pocket. The tow truck driver shook his head and turned to him. You with this guy? Gus nodded, still smirking. Yep, he's my idiot friend. Hey, I protested, but neither of them was paying attention to me anymore. The driver gestured toward the engine. It's just a loose battery cable. You don't need a tow truck for that. I blinked. A what? Gus clapped a hand on my shoulder. Move aside, Arthur. Time for a little life lesson. I stepped back, watching as Gus leaned over and wiggled one of the cables. See this? It's not connected properly. The car can't start if the battery's not actually hooked up right. I felt a heat rise in my face. That's it? That's the problem? That's it, the tow truck driver confirmed, clearly enjoying himself. You'd be surprised how often this happens. Gus reached into his back pocket and pulled out a wrench, like he had known this moment would come. Tighten this up, he said, handing it to me. I hesitated. Me? Yes, you. Go on, Arthur. Become one with the machine. I shot him a look, but I took the wrench anyway. I mimicked his movements, twisting the bolt until it was snug. Gus inspected my work and nodded approvingly. Try it now. I got back in the driver's seat, turned the key, and just like that, the engine roared to life. It was so simple, too simple. I stared at the dashboard, equal parts relieved and mortified. Gus was laughing before I even stepped out of the car. "You called a tow truck for a loose cable? Man, you really are hopeless." The driver chuckled as well. "I'll let you off easy this time," he said. "No charge. But next time, check your battery before you panic." I nodded, feeling ridiculous. "Thanks, and sorry for wasting your time." "No worries," he said, climbing back into his truck. "Happens more than you'd think." As he drove off, Gus leaned against my car, arms crossed, still grinning. "So, what did we learn today?" "That I'm an idiot?" He laughed. "Besides that," I sighed, "that I should probably know more about basic car maintenance." "Bingo! And since I'm such a great friend, I'm gonna teach you." I groaned, but I knew I had no excuse. If I had known something as simple as this, I wouldn't have been in this mess to begin with. And so, for the next hour, Gus gave me a crash course in the basics. How to check oil levels, what to do if the engine overheats, and how to change a tire. By the end of it, my hands were greasy. My head hurt from information overload, but strangely, I felt accomplished. As we packed up, Gus clapped me on the back. "See? Not so bad." I shook my head. "You act like I just performed surgery." "For you? This was a major breakthrough," he said with a wink. I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't deny it. Today had been a wake-up call. Maybe it was time I stopped relying on other people for things I should know how to handle myself. Of course, knowing me, I'd probably forget half of what Gus taught me by next week. But hey, it was a start. I should have known better than to underestimate Gus. The man had a way of cutting through illusions, slicing through the pretense I so carefully constructed around myself. I'd always thought myself clever, always thought I had a way of maneuvering through life that others simply lacked. But Gus saw right through me. And now, here I was, licking my wounds, humbled but not broken, still scheming, still searching for an angle. It had been a rough few days, to put it lightly. My latest endeavor, a deal I'd staked far too much on, had collapsed in spectacular fashion. Investors had pulled out. My so-called allies had turned their backs, and my carefully woven plans had unraveled like a threadbare rug under too much weight. The city had a way of chewing up men like me and spitting them out, but I refused to be among them. Not yet, not ever. I found myself in Gus's shop, the dim light catching on the rows of neatly arranged tools and odds and ends. He was in the back, fixing some contraption with the patience of a man who knew the value of slow, careful work. That was Gus, steady, deliberate, unshakable. The kind of man who, despite his humble means, had a wealth about him that money couldn't touch. A kind of wisdom I hated to admit I envied. "Arthur," he said without looking up, his voice as even as ever, "I thought you'd be by." I forced a smile, though I suspected he could see right through it. What can I say, Gus? You've always been a good listener. He gave a grunt, tightening a bolt before finally straightening to look at me. You need money or advice? I let out a short laugh, more bitter than I intended. Neither. Well, not exactly. I need a man who knows things, knows people, knows how to keep a business from toppling over. Gus wiped his hands on a rag and regarded me carefully. Sounds like you're offering something. I stepped forward, placing my hands on the worn wooden counter between us. Gus, I'm giving you an opportunity, a real one. I want you to be my consultant for practical matters. I let the words linger, giving them the weight of something official, something respectable. High pay, Gus. You'd be set. He chuckled, shaking his head. That's so? I mean it, I pressed. You've got a mind for this, for knowing when something's a fool's errand and when it's got real potential. I need that. You keep me in check, you steer me clear of pitfalls, and in return you get a cut of everything. Gus sighed, rubbing his temple like he was dealing with a stubborn child. Arthur, you don't need a consultant, you need a conscience. That's exactly why I'm asking you, I countered, trying to sound sincere. And maybe I was, at least a little. I know I've got tendencies, but you're grounded, Gus. You see things clearly. He leaned forward on the counter, fixing me with a look that made me feel like I was being measured, weighed, and, inevitably, found wanting. Arthur, he said slowly, some lessons you gotta learn yourself. I felt the sting of it, sharper than I cared to admit. He wasn't rejecting the money. He wasn't rejecting the job. He was rejecting me, the idea that I could be saved from myself by someone else. I swallowed down my pride, or at least tried to. So that's a no then. He gave a small, sad smile. That's a no. The silence stretched between us, heavy with things unsaid. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that I could change, that I wanted to change. But even I didn't believe that, not really. And Gus? He wasn't the type to believe words without actions to back them up. I exhaled, nodding as I pushed off the counter. Fair enough, I muttered, shoving my hands into my pockets. Can't say I didn't try. Gus watched me, his expression unreadable. Arthur, he said as I turned to leave, you're smart, smarter than most. But all that smarts don't mean a damn thing if you keep walking into the same walls. I forced another smile, this one more bitter than the last. Yeah, well, guess I've got a thick skull. He didn't argue, didn't have to. I walked out of Gus's shop, the cool night air hitting me as I stepped onto the street. The city stretched before me, full of possibilities, full of risks. I had no plan, no clear path forward. But I'd be damned if I wasn't going to find one. One way or another, I was going to make this work, with or without Gus. I took a deep breath as I stood outside Marty's butcher shop, the familiar scent of raw meat and sawdust filling my nostrils. The morning chill bit at my skin, but I barely noticed it. My fingers twitched at my sides, uncertain. I had promised myself I was done with this place, yet here I was again, standing at the threshold like some lost soul looking for direction. Through the fogged-up window, I could see Marty at the counter, his sleeves rolled up as he expertly worked a knife through a fresh cut of beef. Gus lounged in his usual spot near the back, pretending not to be interested, but definitely watching. I pushed open the door, and the little bell above jingled. Marty didn't look up, just continued slicing through the meat with practiced precision. I hesitated, then took a few steps forward, my boots scuffing against the tiled floor. "Back again?" Marty finally grumbled, his deep voice carrying the same weight of skepticism it always did when directed at me. "Didn't think you had any more interest in this place." I swallowed, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I want to learn," I said, surprising even myself with how steady my voice was. "Properly this time." Marty stopped, his knife still in hand, and raised an eyebrow. He glanced over at Gus, who, to my annoyance, was already smirking like he'd seen this coming. "Oh, now you want to learn?" Marty wiped his hands on his apron and shook his head. "What changed?" I opened my mouth, but no answer came. I wasn't sure what had changed. Maybe it was the realization that I had spent too long running from things that made me uncomfortable. Maybe it was the way Gus never stopped looking at me like I was missing something obvious. Or maybe, after everything, I just didn't want to leave this place without proving, to myself more than anyone else, that I wasn't the same arrogant fool who had walked in here before. "Just show me," I said instead, "and I'll listen this time." Marty exhaled sharply, muttering something under his breath, but he jerked his head toward the counter. "Fine, grab an apron." I moved quickly before he could change his mind. The apron felt heavy around my neck, the smell of dried blood and iron clinging to it. It wasn't the first time I'd worn one, but this time felt different. Marty pulled a fresh cut from the cold case, placing it in front of me with a thud. "Tell me what this is," he said. I stared at the hunk of meat, willing my brain to work. The deep marbling, the thick layer of fat along one side. It wasn't just a random cut of beef. It had a purpose, a story. I swallowed, forcing myself to recall everything I'd been half listening to before. "Ribeye," I finally said, my voice cautious. Marty's expression didn't change. "Why?" I hesitated, my mind scrambling for the right words. "Because the marbling is dense but evenly spread, and the fat cap is thick but not overwhelming. It's tender, best cooked with high heat, grilled or pan-seared. People like it because it's flavorful without needing much else." Silence. Marty stared at me, his sharp eyes searching for any hint of hesitation. Then, slowly, he gave a small, reluctant nod. "Not bad," he admitted. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Gus snorted from his corner. "Well, well," he said, crossing his arms. Looks like Arthur's finally using his brain for something other than running his mouth. I shot him a glare, but he just grinned wider. Marty wasn't done, though. Now cut it, he said, sliding a knife toward me. I hesitated only for a second before picking it up. It felt natural in my grip, an extension of my hand. But holding a knife and using it properly were two different things. Marty guided me through the motions, his voice gruff but steady. Let the knife do the work. Don't force it. Smooth strokes. I followed his instructions, adjusting my grip as I sliced into the ribeye. The blade moved cleaner than I expected, gliding through muscle and fat with ease. I focused, blocking out everything else. Gus's watching eyes, my own self-doubt. By the time I was finished, I stepped back, exhaling. Marty inspected my work, fingers pressing into the cut edges. He gave another nod, this one less reluctant than before. Acceptable, he said. That was probably the highest praise I'd ever get from him. Gus clapped a hand on my shoulder, laughing. Well, look at that. Marty might actually let you work the counter one day. I scoffed, shaking my head. Don't push your luck. But I couldn't deny the small sense of pride curling in my chest. Marty sighed, taking the knife from me. Don't think this means you're some kind of butcher now, but maybe you're not completely hopeless. It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever get from him. And strangely, it felt like it meant something. I wiped my hands on my apron, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. This wasn't just about identifying a cut of meat. It was about proving something to myself, to Marty, even to Gus. I had come back, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. The low hum of the engine filled the silence as I pulled out of the driveway, the headlights cutting through the dusk. My hands gripped the steering wheel, not out of tension but contemplation. The day had been unexpected. Not that I hadn't encountered challenges before. My career had been built on high-stakes decisions and calculated risks. But today had been different. Today I had been humbled. I had spent the afternoon in Gus's garage, an environment so far removed from the corporate boardrooms I usually occupied that it might as well have been another planet. The scent of oil and grease had filled the air, tools clinking against metal as Gus worked with an ease that spoke of decades of experience. I had gone in expecting to instruct, to bring my expertise to a struggling small business. Instead, I had left feeling like a student. Gus had been patient, his gruff demeanor never quite hiding the amusement dancing in his eyes as he watched me fumble with a simple wrench. It's not just about knowing what to do, he had said. It's about understanding why it's done. That's where real intelligence is. That line echoed in my mind as I drove through the quiet streets, the city lights flickering like distant stars. I prided myself on being sharp, always 10 steps ahead, but today had reminded me that knowledge isn't just power, it's perspective. It's knowing when to listen, when to learn. Reaching for my phone, I scrolled through my schedule, my fingers hesitating over tomorrow's meetings. One in particular stood out, a board meeting that, truth be told, could proceed without me. For years I had believed my presence was indispensable. But was it really? Wasn't true leadership about knowing when to step back? I hit dial. My assistant picked up after the second ring. Arthur? Cancel my afternoon meeting, I said, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as the words left my mouth. And clear my weekend. I'm enrolling in a mechanics course. There was a beat of silence, then, okay, I'll reschedule. I could almost hear the unspoken question in her voice, but I didn't feel the need to explain. This was for me. A chance to step outside my carefully curated world and expand in ways I hadn't considered before. As I pulled up to my driveway, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I had spent years defining intelligence through titles and expertise, but today I had learned something new. Intelligence wasn't just about knowing the answers. It was about knowing the right questions to ask. Meanwhile, across town, Gus leaned against the garage door, watching the taillights of my car disappear into the night. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Maybe I did get through to him after all.